a la Facultat de Biologia, benvinguts en aquesta sessió científica que farem avui. Bé, hem decidit de fer-la en anglès perquè tenim una magnífica convidada en anglès. She almost speaks Catalan by now, but I'm still will do it in English. Jo simplement em presentaré, soc Rosina Gironès, la degana de la Facultat de Biologia i coordinadora del Hub de Sostenibilitat Global de la Universitat de Barcelona. És fantàstic donar-vos la benvinguda. It's a great pleasure to have you here and for sharing a scientific session on forest and climate change, understanding plant responses to help forest management. We also are presenting today what we call Àgora. Those Àgora will be the sessions organized in the Hub of Global Sustainability, and we plan to have those sessions as a place where we can share and stay together, scientists with all the knowledge on critical topics and the presence of also the society and all the involved agents, administration, users, etc. So that will be one of the first Àgoras we have. And let me also introduce you, the people I have around. I'm a lucky girl. And I will introduce you first, Santi Sabater. He is the head of the Department of Evolutive Biology, Ecology, and Environmental Science. And he has been also the godfather and the promoter of the honoris causa for the University of Barcelona that was yesterday awarded to our invited, in my left side, Belinda Medlyn. And it's really a great honor to have you here. Thank you very much. And so we are really happy to have this opportunity to work together in this topic. Let me also thank, and we greatly appreciate also the participation of other participants we have here, other invited speakers here, and also the opportunity of having a debate with also people related to the administration and also end users. Yes. So we have here Jordi Martínez Vilalta, Víctor Resco de Dios, Dani Nadal, Teresa Bages, and Joan Botell. Thank you very much. And let me just finish my introduction here with a small, some meanings related to the forest, because forest is a really complex word that means many things. And I think in addition to the critical role the forests have in the ecosystems, in the ecology of the planet, I think that the forests have another meaning, really important also for humans, like a meaning of well-being, like a place where people now is looking for. There is some movements that's called Return to the Forest in a symbolic way, where the forest could be a place where you reconnect with nature, because many of our societies seems to be quite disconnected. Forest is a place where people either literally or symbolically think on a place to reconnect with nature, to reconnect sometimes with ourselves, to reconnect with silence, with beauty, with solidarity, with many values, slowness, not to go so quickly. And I think that in some way, working for the adaptation of the forest to now, with the climate change we have now here, is in some way to protect also values that are really important for human beings and also life in general. So I stop here and I will give now the microphone to Santi Sabater, who will explain all the details and will be the guide for you in this session.
Thank you, Rosina. Well, you have here the program. Forest and climate change looks a topic very important because we are all getting through these changes, and forests are part of these challenges we have. When we were thinking that Belinda was a doctor honoris causa, she's specialized on these relations and equations and modeling how are the responses, ecophysiological responses forests to environmental conditions, particularly also to conditions like climate change are imposing more droughts, high temperatures. And all these things, it's been a long way since we met in the 90s in the different European projects. But we thought that today is a nice opportunity, because yesterday was a very formal speech, today to put more science on it. And in addition to that, we thought that it would be nice to have also other researchers like Jordi Martínez Vilalta, who is very well known, working at CREAF, an autonomous university, working on droughts and these hydraulic issues in trees, and also this dieback of the trees all over the world, not just only the Mediterranean, but we decided that he would present something in this area. Also, Victor Resco used to be at the place where Belinda is sitting, in the office in Australia where Belinda is sitting, and he's been working a lot on fires and the drivers of fire, so we decided to bring some of this. And we are also involved in a project named Informa, European project, where we are trying to optimize through forest management the ecosystem services. So that's a nice opportunity to also present what we are doing there. And Danny is working in these simulations and work in relation to these ecosystem services. It will be a nice opportunity to see how they are affected by these projections, by climate change. And then the other side, we need to know how we connect this science to the people, the stakeholders that are developing the applications we are suggesting through science. And then we ask also Teresa Bages, who is at the Centre de la Propietat Forestal. She is also a participant in this project, Informa project, so it's also a nice way to start to show things like we are doing with Danny. But also the difficulties the administration has to implement, change the view of what we should do in the forest to get through these changes. And then also there is the need of, the stakeholders that Joan Boutet is a forest owner. He's been involved, or at least very much interested at European scale, I would say, on how to get this knowledge to the practitioners. So we will have them, two of them later after these more academic talks, but to ask questions, to see how we can bridge the knowledge to the practice. And this is the idea of the session today. Now, Belinda, you can have your presentation. Thank you.
And I have the pointer? Yep. All right. Let me just verify. Hang on. It's, there should be an on switch.
Yes, it is. This is the pointer.
Okay.
And this is to get up and...
Okay, great. Okay. Got it. All right. All right. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Particularly thank you very much to Santi for organising all of this. Yesterday's ceremony was really a great honour, something very special and quite unforgettable. And it's wonderful also to have the opportunity to have this colloquium today. I'm really looking forward to the discussions and comparisons between the work that we've been doing in Australia and some of the work that's going on here in Catalonia. There are so many similarities between the sorts of things that we're seeing and the sorts of things that you're seeing, but of course they're different. They're in a different context. So I find that comparing responses across these different systems is really insightful to help us understand the generalities. So my talk is going to focus very much on Australia. but I'm assuming that you will see, as I talk, a lot of parallels as I go through, which will be very interesting to discuss. So, I should first just introduce you to some of the Australian vegetation types that I'm talking about. So Australia, of course, it's a big country. It ranges from 10 degrees of latitude down to about 43 degrees of latitude. So it's covering a wide range of climate space. We have a range of vegetation, and here I arrange them from wet to dry. So we have tropical rainforests in the north, which are not dissimilar to the tropical rainforests that you find in Indonesia and Malaysia. We have a lot of wet, temperate sclerophyll rainforests. So it's dominated by eucalypts. So this is Eucalyptus regnans, the tallest flowering tree species, which grows up to 100 metres in wet environments in the south of the country. As you move to slightly drier areas, you get into dry sclerophyll forests, which are dominated also typically by eucalypts, sometimes the native pines, with a shrubby understory. We also have grassy woodlands, again mostly dominated by eucalypts, but with a grassy understory, typically in slightly drier areas. And then as you move into drier areas still, we get the mallee eucalypts, which are multi-stemmed, quite short tree species. And then in the interior of the country, there's a lot of arid woodlands, which are typically dominated by acacia, so nitrogen fixers, again, short tree species. So that's the broad range of vegetation types that we have, and this is just to give you an indication of whereabouts they occur. So this gives you an idea of the structure of the forest in different locations. So in the south we have those tall, wet eucalypt forests. In the north we have the rainforests. You get dry and grassy woodlands on this edge. As you move into the arid interior, you get the semi-arid woodlands. So a range of vegetation types, very, very much structured by climate, which gives rise to the conclusion that as the climate changes, we should expect to see really quite some significant changes in the vegetation. So our question is really, what sorts of changes should we be expecting and whereabouts? And we are currently using a dynamic vegetation model to try and gather together all of the data and information that we have to try and make those predictions. The model that we're using is called LPJ Guess. It was actually developed by a colleague of mine, Ben Smith, while he was living in Sweden. So this model is a really useful model because it integrates all of the processes that we think are relevant to understand vegetation dynamics. It has primary production and growth, it incorporates plant biogeography, soil feedbacks, population dynamics, responses to disturbance. But it is developed with what we would call a kind of northern hemisphere bias. So the vegetation types are global, but they don't necessarily match very well with the types of vegetation that I just described to you. So when we look at how that model performs in Australia, this is how it currently predicts the leaf area index of different vegetation types across Australia. So leaf area index being the amount of leaf per unit ground area in metres squared per metre squared. So if you have a leaf area index of 1, then you have just canopy coverage, if you like. So the vegetation types that it predicts dominate in Australia are typically the broadleaf evergreens, temperate and tropical, some shade intolerant, some rain green, types of vegetation, and then C3 and C4 grasses. But what you see here is that the classification of vegetation types is really about temperature, so it's particularly temperate and tropical, and responses to light, so shade intolerant and shade tolerant, but not so much water classes. And so that's our principal focus at the moment, is thinking about water adaptation and how we introduce plant functional types that really represent that range of drought adaptation. So the plant functional types that we're working with, in particular, we're classifying them as tall, medium and short, but they are intended to represent that spectrum of water adaptation. So tall being mesic species, short being the semi-arid species. And the other key distinction that we make is between reseeding and resprouting species, because this is something that really governs the dynamics of Australian forests, is whether after disturbance they can come back through resprouting, so many of the species can do that, or whether they are killed and need to regrow from seed. So those are the sorts of questions that we're thinking about trying to parameterise. And I know there's quite some expertise on drought in the room, so one of the things that I wanted to do was to run through the way that we're thinking about how to represent the drought categories and see if it's similar to the thoughts here. So where we are concentrating our efforts is thinking about water transport. So my good colleague Brendan Choate is working a lot on plant hydraulics. These are some images that he's taken looking at what happens in stems of trees as water stress increases. So what you see here is water stress increasing and bubbles forming in the xylem, causing cavitation and tree death. And so this process progresses at a fairly predictable rate, which gives us some useful information for trying to predict the vulnerability of different types of plant species. So there you have a completely cavitated stem. So we're thinking about the impacts of water stress in kind of two phases. There's the phase of stomatal conductance closing. So phase one is where you first come into drought stress, the stomatal aperture declines, and the plants will try to save water by closing their stomata. After stomatal closure occurs, the plants will continue to lose water and they will enter that phase of the loss of xylem hydraulic conductivity. And eventually they will lose sufficient hydraulic conductivity to cause them to die, which may happen, typically people say at about a loss of 50% for conifers, a loss of 88% for angiosperms is the threshold beyond which trees can't come back again. Of course, we're trying to narrow down those thresholds properly, but that's roughly a rule of thumb. So the approach that we are taking in our modelling is to represent those two phases separately. So there's a phase of stomatal closure, and we understand from some work that was actually done here by a student of ours who came to visit Santi, Shuangxi Zhou, that there is there's an adaptation of the rate of stomatal closure that depends on how strongly drought adapted your species are. So you can see here we're comparing sets of eucalypts and sets of oaks that are more or less drought adapted, and the stomatal closure is slower in the species that are more strongly drought adapted. Beyond that stomatal closure phase, we then simulate the hydraulic failure phase. So the plants start with their stomata closed, but they continue to lose water through their cuticles. And so as that process continues, eventually you'll start to see leaf death. That process continues at a pretty much linear rate. So it allows us to predict the rate at which you approach the catastrophic loss of hydraulic conductivity. And I'm really sorry about my fonts, which did not translate very well here. What I'm trying to say in this heading is that the stomatal closure coincides with the onset of xylem embolism in trees. So typically what we see, this is an example from one arid zone, eucalypt. This is the black dots of the stomatal closure. The triangles are the onset of the loss of hydraulic conductivity. Typically what we see is that as you lose stomatal conductance, that's where you start to see the loss of hydraulic conductivity starting to occur. And those two processes are really well coordinated across a range of species. So here we tested this relationship for 14 different species from rainforests, wet sclerophyll forests, dry sclerophyll forests, grassy woodlands and semi-arid woodlands. And there's a really strong coordination between the point at which the stomata close and the point at which xylem embolism starts to occur. So the trees have really adapted to shut their stomata to protect their xylem. So this modelling approach we have used to try to predict responses to severe drought. And we had the occasion to test this model because of what's been dubbed the tinderbox drought, which occurred in Australia in 2018 to 2019. We had 2 years of about 50% mean annual rainfall across the country, across most of the country. And so this was a really severe drought comparable to some of the worst droughts that have occurred over the previous century, and of course culminated in the fire, the extraordinary fire season that we had at the end of 2019. And so one thing that we realised fairly early on while we were doing this work was that no one was actually monitoring tree death in Australia. So we started looking for data sets to evaluate our capacity to predict tree mortality, and it became clear that there was no systematic monitoring of tree mortality. So that became a real problem for testing our models, so we set up this citizen science initiative. So citizen science is often used for people to upload pictures of, organisms that they've seen, that they want to report. We set up a portal whereby people could post pictures of dead trees, and that was really, really valuable during that 2018-19 drought because we had lots of people making observations, particularly in this region in New South Wales. So there was a lot of tree mortality being reported during that period. These hotspots in Western Australia and Tasmania are actually from the summer just gone because there was a severe drought in those regions just most recently. So we have some information about where dieback is occurring. One downside of using citizen science is that it relies on there being citizens there to report things. And of course, in the interior of Australia, there is not a lot of population. So it may look like we don't have very many reports from the centre, but we are working with a number of parks and non-governmental organisations who have properties that they're managing in the arid zone, and there's been a number of reports of dieback even in the interior of the country. So this is in really, really drought-adapted, very hardy vegetation, but that drought during that period was severe enough that we saw mass mortality in this species in a number of different parts of its range. And the estimates are of around about 25% mortality in some of those areas. We were able to get a team of people to go and visit a number of the sites that were reported through the Dead Tree Detective. Here are some of the sites that they visited. And one of the things that they did was to look at the loss of hydraulic conductivity in the stem following these periods of mortality to verify the mechanism that was causing this dieback. And so what they found was that there was a really strong relationship between the degree of canopy loss and the percent loss of conductivity in the stem. So the more the canopy had been browned, the larger the loss of hydraulic conductivity, which is a good thing for us because it confirms our hypothesis that what's driving the mortality is the loss of hydraulic conductivity. Hang on. So we applied this model with the two-phase stomatoconductance hydraulic failure to try to predict canopy mortality during this drought of 2017 to 2019. On the left, you see the predicted loss of conductivity. On the right, you see it's a remote sensing measure which attempts to estimate the loss of canopy mortality using something called vegetation optical depth. There's a number of different approaches to try to look at this with remote sensing. This one is supposedly sensitive to both biomass and water content, so we felt it was a good way to contrast the model predictions. And as you can see, it's not terrible. We're at least getting the same sorts of patterns. One of the big issues that we face, though, is the issue of resprouting and recovery. So we're fairly confident that we can predict the loss of canopies, but because many of our species have the capacity to resprout, we don't necessarily know if trees are dead during that drought period. You actually need to go back about 3 years later to test whether they've died or not. And so Brendan has a PhD student who's in the process of revisiting all of our sites to work out how many trees actually died and compare that with remote sensing observations. And this is not atypical. What you see is that the remote sensing data shows a big anomaly in 2020, so the canopies have browned off, and you can see that really clearly in the satellite signal. But then it rains again, and it looks like the site has greened up a lot. But what you're actually seeing there is the understory, not the overstory trees. So this site in particular, it's about 65% of the basal area died, and yet it looks like it's recovered. And unfortunately, many of our statistics are based on this remotely sensed NDVI. So it suggests that we've had full recovery, whereas we know that we actually lost something like 50, 60% of the basal area in some of these locations. So this continues to be a challenge for us. Yes, so many of our species can resprout. But like I said, it will take a little while to determine whether the resprouting has been successful or not. So what you'll see is immediately after it starts raining, they'll come up with epicormic resprouts. Some of them will recover fully, some of them will resprout a bit, but like this tree on the right, that's probably not going to survive because it's not resprouted enough to be able to make it through the next few seasons. So that is a real challenge to try and predict how much resprouting and recovery we'll be able to see in different ecosystems. We are focusing on looking at non-structural carbohydrates because we're aware that the reserves of non-structural carbohydrates in the stem are what is used to rebuild the canopy. So these are some nice electron microscope photographs that were taken by my colleague Sebastian Fauch in an ecosystem where the trees actually lost their leaves because of an insect outbreak. But immediately we looked at We looked at some samples that were taken before the trees reflushed and after the trees reflushed their canopies. And you can see here the starch globules in the stem, highlighted in blue. And so before and after regrowing our canopies gives you some idea of how much of the reserves they actually need to use to rebuild their canopy. We're also aware that when they're rebuilding their canopy after drought, it's not just the leaves that they need to rebuild, it's also the stems that they need to rebuild. And this is work that was done by one of Brendan's PhD students, Alice Gorty, where she was looking at some eucalypts that had been very severely droughted, so they'd lost their leaves, and you can see the drought-induced embolism in here. Then they were re-watered. She wanted to know whether they would be able to recover, and what she found was that they could only recover by regrowing the xylem. So to be able to come back from a drought where you lose your leaves, you not only need to rebuild your leaves, but you also need to rebuild all of the pipes that supply those leaves. So some of the work that's being done in our groups at the moment is really looking at how much non-structural carbohydrate do you need to rebuild these canopies, and what is the size of the reserves in different types of species. There's also, of course, a really strong connection with fire. So this comparison is taken from 2019. So on the right, you see our reports of tree mortality from the Dead Tree Detective. On the left, you see a snapshot of fires near me, which is our hazard reporting system during bushfires in Australia, which all of us who are living in bushy areas during this period were checking on an hourly basis. And you can see basically that the fires in this period were really following where we were seeing canopy dieback. And so my colleague Rachel Nolan has done some really nice work looking at the connection between fire risk and drought risk. And what she found, particularly during that period, was that the threshold for the increase in fire activity really corresponded quite closely with the live fuel moisture content at the onset of leaf shedding. So at the point where the trees are dry enough to start losing leaves is the point where the fire risk in our forests really takes off. So there's a really interesting discussion going on at home between the drought scientists and the fire scientists, who historically have not talked a lot to each other, but are realising that they're actually trying to work on the same problem. There is a lot of work going on looking at fire impacts, particularly with my colleague Rachel Nolan, Matthias Bohr, their postdoc Eli Bendel. So I don't really have time to go into that work now, but I just wanted to highlight that it exists. So some of the work is about quantifying fire risk to try and understand where fires are likely to occur, but then a lot of the work is also about quantifying what the fire impacts are. So here you see an example from a paper that Rachel led looking at the loss of carbon after fire and how it depended on the severity of the fire. So how much carbon did you lose in an extremely severe fire versus a low to moderate severity fire? So to quantify carbon losses from the point of view of carbon sequestration, but also understanding the fuel dynamics. And so there's also work going on looking at losses of trees due to fire. So how many trees die following fire, particularly where there has been drought in advance. And work looking at the rate of fuel accumulation following fire as well, because that then feeds into our predictions of the fire risk for the next fire season, is how much fuel has accumulated since the last fire. Yeah, I mean, in summary, what's being seen there, we've had several very wet years since that 2019 drought, and that has caused the fuel loads to really rapidly come back again. So the next fire season is likely to have a full fuel load again. Coming back to the model, obviously we're really interested in predicting drought and effects of drought, and we think that there will likely be significant changes as a result of increasing drought severity in Australia. But in our models at the moment, typically what we're seeing is a long-term increase in leaf area index. So this is what LPJ Guess predicts for the continent of Australia as a whole over the last century, is really quite a significant increase in leaf area index, with some drops related to the droughts, but still a strong recovery. And that's driven by CO2 fertilisation. So all of these models have in them really quite a strong effect of CO2 fertilisation. And so we still have a very interesting discussion going on about, well, how important is that response to CO2 compared to the dynamics related to drought and fire? One experiment that we have in Western Sydney that's yielding some very interesting results is this Uke Face experiment. It's a free air CO2 enrichment experiment. So these pipes deliver CO2 to the forest. And we can raise the CO2 concentration in the area surrounded by those pipes to 150 parts per million above the ambient CO2 concentration. So this experiment has been running since 2012. And you may have seen that we have published a number of papers about the fact that there has been no above ground response of productivity in this forest. So we've managed to put together a whole ecosystem carbon budget to understand how much extra carbon have they taken up and where has it gone. And the short answer is that the GPP increased of the order of 11%. So there was extra carbon going into the system, but most of it came back out again fairly rapidly through soil respiration. So our understanding was that this forest, which is on a very poor phosphorus-limited soil, did not respond to the high CO2 because the trees didn't have sufficient phosphorus to support an increase in productivity, which would suggest that those models are overestimating the response to CO2. Where are we? But that part of the story is only for the first 4 or 5 years of the experiment. And since then, we've had some really extreme years of rainfall. So you can see this 2018 to 2019 drought where we had really low rainfall for 2 years in a row. And then since then, we've had 3 years of floods. And these data are not published yet and have yet to be fully substantiated. But what it looks like is that we are now starting to see an increase in above ground productivity in the dry years. So what you see here is the ratio of above ground productivity in the elevated to the ambient treatments, no response in the first 4 years. Here are our 3 years of drought. We're actually starting to look at a 30% increase in above ground productivity. So it's possible that we do see a CO2 response in dry conditions where presumably the competition for phosphorus isn't as strong. So we're still working through the implications of this finding, but it does seem like the story regarding the CO2 response isn't that there's no response. It may be more that there is a response in the dry years. And that is supported by some work looking at remotely sensed NDVI. So this is work that was done by a colleague, Sami Rifai, where he looked at trends in NDVI, so greenness observed by satellites between 1980 and 2020. And he's compared that trend in NDVI with the trend in the moisture index, so the ratio of precipitation to potential evapotranspiration. And typically what he finds for pixels across eastern Australia is that most of them have become more arid, so this ratio of rainfall to potential evapotranspiration has decreased, and yet the NDVI has increased. So there has been greening in a number of parts of the eastern part of Australia, which would tend to suggest that there is a CO2 response which can fertilise the vegetation despite increases in aridity. However, so like I said, we're still working through all the implications of this, and we're still looking at all the different types of data sets. So another thing that we've been looking at is the forest inventory. So now we're looking at forest inventory for eastern Australia to detect whether there's been a change in growth rate of forests. So satellite greenness is one thing. As I talked to you earlier about, satellite greenness just shows you greenness. It doesn't necessarily show you the vegetation growth rates or the forest growth rates. And so another student of ours, Reeling Liu, has been looking at this forest inventory. She's looked at 3 different types of inventory. So there's the savannas, the tropical forests, warm temperate and cold temperate. And she is not seeing an increase in growth rate over time, rather typically a decrease in growth rate over time. So we are, I can't give you a complete answer yet. We're still trying to pull all of these different threads together to understand what the dynamics are. It's a real, it's a challenge to look at all these different types of data and try to understand what's going on. But I guess my sense is that we are seeing increased greenness, but we're not seeing increased tree productivity. So we need to distinguish between the two things. So if we want to know how the vegetation is changing, it's not a simple story of it's greener or it's less green. It's a more complicated story that talks about forest growth rates versus greenness. So I will finish up there. I'm looking forward very much to hearing how this compares to what's being discussed here. But let me thank the many people who've supported this research. As you can see, there's a large team at the Hawkesbury Institute for the Environment who are involved in the modelling, in the drought work and in the fire work, and thanks to them all.
Thank you. We have, if you have any question right now, we have also the opportunity later on to have the discussion when all the presentations have been done. But if you want to question.
I'm sorry. I am Juan Botey. I am a forest owner. 55 years living in the forest. And, your speech was sensational, eh? Sensational. Many things I have not understood, but one thing that maybe I have not seen is the interaction between the bushes and the trees for the water.
For water.
Yes, water. This because here in we have many interaction between between bushes and trees for the water. And the management of bushes can make better situation for the water attraction of atmospheric water attraction more than rain.
Okay, so bushes, you mean?
Yes, the laurisilva system, laurisilva system. The laurisilva system. Here in my forest, we have really very big difference between the captation of atmospheric water, and then you can, with the management of the bushes, you can proportion more water to the trees.
So
I only ask if you have experience in that.
So you're saying that you would remove the understory, you take away the bushes?
No, selectively. In selection. Not all, because if I take all, then the wind can arrive to the soil and the evapotranspiration is growing.
Yep. Yes. Yeah. And I've got to think about what do we have that's relevant. I'm not aware of anyone that has tried to manage the bushes. I think that the demand of water from the bushes is probably quite small compared to the trees in our systems. Oh, I know, but you're talking about in eucalypts as well, aren't you? Because the trees use a lot of the water. Typically what we find is that the understory comes and goes of its own accord. So you see the shrubs will die back before the trees do. And then they come back again when it greens up. So it's interesting, I'm not aware of anyone who's discussing removing the shrubs. There is a lot of discussion about removing the shorter trees. So they call it ecological thinning, and the idea is to remove some of the trees which are performing less well and are shorter, to allow there to be more water for the larger trees. So I think the emphasis is more on taking away the short trees, the suppressed trees, rather than the shrubs. But that's very interesting. It'd be good to talk to you later to find out more details of how you're doing that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joan and Belinda. Any other question? Yeah?
Hi. Sorry. Hi. I had a question about your point about how greenness and forest growth may not be directly related to each other. I think you mean it specifically about like remote sensing data sets that look at. So I'm not a scientist, I'm actually an economist, so some part of this I may not get very well. But as far as I understand, these GPP data sets that NASA and whatnot provide literally claim to measure photosynthesis. Like even the measurement itself is, the unit of it is supposed to be megagrams per hectare, et cetera. So are we implying that these data sets might not be reliable? I believe the paper that you mentioned isn't published yet. I couldn't find the, yeah. So is that one of the claims here, or are we saying like?
Yeah, so with all remote sensing data, it's really valuable to understand that they are not measuring exactly the thing that you might be interested in. So you're talking about GPP. So GPP is photosynthesis. And so it's neither greenness nor biomass, it's another thing. But there's a couple of different products that people have developed from satellites which estimate GPP. So one of them is based on the greenness, and there's a correlation between the greenness and the GPP, which allows you to estimate what the GPP is. There's another one that's based on something called solar-induced fluorescence. which relates to the way that electrons interact with the leaves and is supposed to give you an idea of photosynthesis. But all of those products, they are fundamentally, they're correlations. So it's a correlation between something that you can see with a satellite and something that you can observe on the ground. And so to some extent, they're a really good estimate of what's going on the ground because it's, you know, it's continuous, it's spatial, you can get regular estimates. But you do have to be aware that there are some discrepancies between what you're actually seeing from the satellites and what's happening on the ground.
Sure. And obviously I would agree, but from what I understood, the paper itself was looking at forest inventories around the world, I believe, across multiple climates. So we are making kind of a wide-ranging claim there potentially. And on the other hand, sure, like correlation isn't causation per se, but a lot of the previous analyses that we're doing are also essentially based on correlation. So why are we considering this form of correlation to not be as relevant?
It's because it's not the fact that correlation isn't causation. It's more about, probably the best example I can give is that you can get a spatial correlation which may not be the same as your temporal correlation. So with remote sensing, you're getting repeat estimates over time, but you're also getting a spatial variability. So it's very easy to go to Australia where you've got this huge range in greenness from, you know, east to west, and you can find a good correlation between what you measure on the ground and what you see on the satellites spatially, but to then say it's the same temporally. So if I see that change in one pixel in one place over time, I can infer that it is it's actually a different ecosystem that's come in. You can't say that spatial and temporal correlations are the same.
Right.
So it's more that, yeah, there is a correlation, but it's not necessarily telling you exactly what's happening on the ground.
Right. So we're saying over time, let's say structural changes in the ecosystem may not be. Okay.
Yep.
No, makes
Yep.
sense. Thank you.
Just last question before continuing.
Hi, Belinda, thanks. I had the question regarding the leaf area index dynamics, and especially regarding the leaf shedding dynamics. If you have found several or any gradient regarding moisture or used to experience drought, different vegetation types, that they shed their leaves at different rates or they have different leaf shedding response, because this should be, in theory, correlated to the availability of the carbohydrates availability and the recovery capabilities of such vegetation. So I was wondering, following the works from Chris Blackman and so on, if you have found this trend across Australia.
Yeah, it's something that is not measured often enough. So I actually have a lot of questions. Chris's experiments were done in pots. So he had potted eucalypts and he could look at the point at which they started to drop leaves, and he was measuring the water potential at the same time. So he could actually make a really nice correlation between the leaf litter loss with the water potential, but it's much rarer to have that information in the field. So I don't have a really good understanding yet of the actual dynamics that you see in the field. You can get, sometimes you will get leaf shedding during drought, but other times you see situations where the trees hang on to their leaves longer because they can't afford to lose those leaves because they can't grow anymore. And so at Ukeface we have seen during that really long drought, actually there was a big pulse of litter fall once it started to rain and the trees could generate new leaves. So the dynamics are a bit complicated and you need information from the field, and I'm still trying to get my hands on those data sets.
Yeah, well, the interest is to include these processes into the models, because to me it's a very combining the observations of Israeli team from Tamir Klein and Yuri Hochberg and several other reports, your reports in Australia, Chris Blackman's. One thing that one thinks when looks at the data, it's that there should be some optimality theory, or there should be some optimality principia describing the advantages of maintaining the leaves and the disadvantages on losing water to the leaves once the stomata are closed.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. It's a really interesting field to think about optimal behaviour in, but I haven't seen any good examples of people tackling that problem yet. It's difficult to set up the optimisation to be able to solve it.
Thank you. I think now we can move on with the shorter presentations, but interesting too. First, Jordi, maybe.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks, Belinda, for this wonderful talk you gave that shows very clearly why you got the honoris causa degree yesterday. Actually, my talk will have quite a few overlaps with Belinda's. I hope also a little bit of a different perspectives in some elements that make it interesting and not completely repetitive of what you already said. I will focus a bit more on what happens in, I said here Mediterranean forest, but actually I will try to give examples of what happens to the forests around us. But as you will see, the overall approach and perspective is not that different from the one taken by Belinda. And actually probably my talk is a bit more general in many ways. I will start by saying some very general aspects about water and forests and why this is relevant under climate change. I will stop a little bit to talk about the impact of drought on the forests around us, and then I will, for the most of the talk, I will focus on whether we can predict when this mortality or these impacts of drought happen, and to what extent we can really make predictions about the future. You know that making predictions is difficult, and this is, again, very much related to what Belinda presented. And then, because my conclusion, you will see, is not incredibly optimistic as to how much we can predict at present these events, I will try to give some future prospects of ways I see promising in that regard. Okay. Oops. No. So which is the? Doesn't matter, I can use this one. Don't worry. I will use this. I think the pointer is working, which is most. No. No problem. I can use this. I think, yes, perfect. And the pointer is here, yes. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to say, which is incredibly general, but I think it's important to keep this in mind, no? It's that plants and forests in general use a lot of water. And a lot of water really means a lot of water. No? So if we look at this at the global scale, it turns out that basically as much water travels through the stems of plants from the soil to the atmosphere, more or less, as all the water carried by all the rivers of the earth. And that's a huge amount of water. And what is very interesting, and this is, again, something that Belinda already told us about, is that all this water actually is transported through the stems of plants, and is transported through this intricate system of interconnected conduits that we call the xylem, basically the wood of trees. It's quite amazing to think that all this water really is transported through these microscopic conduits from the roots to the leaves of plants. And basically, as Belinda already explained, and I will come back a little bit to this later, this really seems to be a weak point of all the system, of all the functioning of plants, and particularly in relation to how they respond to drought. Because at the end, all the water that comes from the soil and is evaporated in the leaves, which is essential to maintain photosynthesis or maintain the functioning of plants, has to pass through this network of conduits in the xylem. Something else very general I wanted to highlight that also was mentioned a little bit in Belinda's talk is that we tend to think that for drought and for water availability, what matters is rainfall, and of course that's true. That's ultimately all the water that will become available to plants. But actually temperatures are also very important, because for plants really drought is about the amount of water available in the soil relative to the water that is demanded by the atmosphere. And this atmospheric demand actually depends heavily on temperature. And this is because the total amount, so the maximum amount of water that the atmosphere can hold, so saturated vapor pressure, vapor content of the atmosphere, actually increases exponentially with temperature. That means that when we move from, for example, around 25 degrees here to 35 degrees here, even if the relative humidity is the same, we will have an increase in what we call the vapor pressure deficit, so really the evaporative demand of the atmosphere. And this obviously is clearly connected with climate change, because even in places where we don't have a decline in rainfall, or we don't have a change in the distribution of rainfall or extreme events, which is yet another topic, we expect lower water availability and higher drought, simply because the atmosphere will be demanding more water from vegetation. And there is lots of information, lots of evidence showing that this vapor pressure deficit of the atmosphere is increasing and will continue to increase due to climate change. And of course, we are already seeing the impact of these increases in aridity. There has been a lot of work in trying to put together all the episodes of forest decline around the world. This is just one of the last publications putting together all this information. There are hundreds of episodes that have been registered. Of course, these are all quite recent, and it's not that obvious that, I mean, it's hard to tell many times whether we see more and more of these episodes simply because we are looking more for them, with more people, more researchers interested in these episodes, or whether they are actually increasing over time objectively. But there is more and more evidence that at least in many regions they are increasing actually. And a very interesting aspect here is that, as you see, there are lots of these episodes around the Mediterranean basin, and many of them in the Iberian Peninsula and in Catalonia. But actually we also have episodes of drought-induced forest decline in areas that we would consider not water limited at all, like the Amazonian rainforest. And I will come back to this later, why this is the case, which I think is a very important element to consider. Of course, the fact that there is an episode of drought-induced mortality has implications for the functioning of forests, and this is an example from the Sierra de los Filabres in Almería. It's quite, I mean, of course, this place is a bit special because this is plantations of Scots pine and black pine, I think it's called in English, in places where probably this species should have never been planted. But if you think of something that was a pine forest and then basically now all the pines have died, it's obvious that this will have huge implications for the energy balance, for the water balance, and obviously as well for the carbon balance of the forest. And of course, this will feed back into climate change, because the forests are absorbing quite a bit of carbon. If there is widespread mortality of forests, that will change the carbon balance potentially at the global scale as well. So it's very important to understand all these feedbacks. And coming back to the more local events we've seen. Actually, I think that some of the first events of drought-induced mortality that were published in the international literature came from Catalonia, and actually they came from these examples you have at the top. They happened in the 90s, after the drought we had in 1994 in particular, which was in many places in the northeastern Spain still the most severe drought we've ever had, at least summer drought. But we've kept seeing similar episodes over the more recent years, up to basically, this past summer, and in particular the previous one. As many people, I mean, most people here will know, we really are just coming out of a very, very strong drought that lasted for over 3 years, and this has really been showing also in our forest, and this has been in the news many times. And actually, something that is interesting, that parallels a little bit, again, something that you showed for Australia, is that, well, actually we have a citizen science project for our own sort of tree detective thing, which is called Alerta Forestal. It's not this. I don't think it's working incredibly well so far in terms of getting consistent spatial information, but we have something different that we started over a decade ago called the Boscat, which is a more institutional program in which our forest rangers basically are mapping every year in September the drought, well, the forest decline episodes that are associated to drought, associated in very sort of broad terms, because it's not easy to know exactly what are the causes of mortality. And I will also discuss this a little bit later. But the question is that we start to have a sort of relatively long temporal series of how much forest area has been affected by these episodes. There is not a very clear pattern. Actually, 2012, which is the first year, was extremely dry, so we started with a relatively high affectation. 2016 was another very dry year, and we indeed saw an increase again in the number of episodes. And the last 3 years that, as I said, had been extremely dry, it's very clear that they have resulted also in an increase in the amount of forests that are affected by this drought-induced decline. So it makes sense temporally, and also we have some evidence that a study we did actually with the first year data that we are able to explain to some extent the spatial patterns of this mortality based on climatic and species level data, which is promising. Something else I wanted to mention is that, particularly in our context, I think this applies probably to everywhere, but specifically in our context, it's impossible to understand what's happening without considering the changes in forest management and land use over the last decades. Because, again, as most of you know, our forests tend to be much denser than they were because there has been a lot of abandonment of previous agricultural lands. And it's not also the density of the forest, but also the type of forest, the composition of the forests has been changing. And this is a study using Spanish national inventory data. You see here the range of altitudes in the x-axis, and the percentage of plots are the bars for conifers in the upper panel and broadleaves in the lower panel for the whole of Spain. And the circles and the lines basically show the percentage of plots in which this particular group, conifers or broadleaves, became extinct, these are the black circles, or colonized, the white ones, the empty ones. And what is very clear is that for conifers, there is much more extinction, particularly at lower altitudes, and the opposite happens for broadleaves, pretty much, for the whole altitudinal range. Basically, what that means is that we have more and more broadleaf forests and less conifer forests. And again, there might be a climate interaction of this, but the main reason for this clearly is management. We have so the use of broadleaves has declined a lot in management over the last decades, particularly since the 60s and 70s. This is not so much the case for conifers. I'm talking generally for the whole of Spain. And indirectly, this has been favoring the dominance of broadleaves. And this has many functional implications. So this is another study we did recently looking at national forest inventory data. And what we see is that we see many interesting things happening over the last 25 years. This is for Catalonia only. We see that forests have been moving towards higher drought tolerance at the community level. So it's a small effect, but there is an increase in the abundance of species that are relatively drought tolerant over those that are not as drought tolerant. That makes sense because we've been moving into a drier climate. And that would actually predict, in terms of productivity of the forest, of forest growth, a decline in growth, because we know that at the species level, the species that are, at least in Catalonia, the species that are more resistant, more tolerant to drought tend to grow less. But actually, when we look at the temporal trends, we don't see any change in productivity. And the reason is that we also see, at the same time, an increase in diversity, an increase in the richness, specifically in the richness of hydraulic traits like the ones that Belinda mentioned before. So there seems to be several patterns going on, all of them having to do, well, partially with the changes in management and land use, partially with the changes in climate, and it's not always obvious to predict the net outcome because some of them compensate each other. And actually, even more recently, this is not published, we've seen that these more these forests that are more diverse in hydraulic traits, actually they are more stable, more resilient to droughts in the last decade. So basically, they are able to maintain their productivity more constant, even in the face of increasing droughts. So with all this in mind, really, what is that we would like to know? We would like to know how the forest of the future will be. And in particular, I mean, of course, this is a complicated question that also was tackled by Belinda's talk, but if we are a bit less ambitious, we can try to split the problem and at least try to understand when these drought-induced mortality episodes, these drought-induced effects are going to be more frequent, or when and where they are going to happen. And this question is not easy because as much as we know that these drought-induced mortality episodes happen, we also know that there are many resilience mechanisms, stabilization mechanisms in forests that oppose these changes. And it's, again, not easy to put all this together to make good predictions. And just to give an example of why this is complicated, this is the data of this same Deboscat program I mentioned that puts together all the forest decline episodes in Catalonia for the last decade or so. And what we did here was to basically put the percentage area affected for each of the main species we have relative to the overall area, the distribution range of the species in Catalonia, as a function of minimum precipitation, as a measure of, a very macroscopic empirical measure of drought tolerance. And a very simplistic view would be, okay, we expect that these variables, so species that are really closer to they are more drought adapted, so they are able to live in drier places, will show less drought-induced mortality, simply because they are already adapted to this drought. And what we see actually is something that is very different. We don't see, actually, at least I don't see any pattern here. Well, maybe there are some patterns. We see that the species that are more affected, like beech or these oaks, are species, in particular beech, that are really reach the southern distribution limit in Catalonia. So this is a very easy and simple prediction to make. These species probably indeed are under higher risk. But in other cases, we also have other species like Abies alba that are close to their southern distribution limit, and they seem to be doing fine. So it's not easy to see very obvious patterns, at least macroscopically, to understand what's going on and to identify the species that are more under higher risk. And we, of course, make the same and with other variables, and the outcome was pretty much the same. So we are not able to really simply predict what species are being more affected by drought. And of course, you might say, and it's true, that we know much more about what the drought responses of plants are, and we can do much more sophisticated things than just looking at the overall distribution and trying to relate this with the risk of mortality. And this, you have already seen this. Actually, this comes from one of Brenda's papers, so that's not a coincidence that you've seen it. And so I will not repeat that, but what I wanted to highlight this is, as I said, that we understand that quite a bit the responses of plants to drought, and we think we understand also quite a bit the mechanisms leading to mortality specifically, which is not the same, but is obviously connected. And there is this critical role of this tissue here, the xylem, in particular the vulnerability of the xylem to embolism. No? So this loss of conductivity as the drought progresses. And also, of course, it's not as simple as that, but even all the other responses like stomatal closure or leaf shedding that have been also discussed, we believe that they are pretty much related to the avoidance of this embolism happening because of the irreversibility of this embolism at least in the short term. But the question is that even when we use these traits, these hydraulic traits that we believe are key in predicting drought responses, actually predicting mortality turns out to be quite difficult. And there has been lots of papers being published recently trying to ask and answer why this is the case. Why is it the case that we think we understand the process and yet we fail? Well, that's like seeing the glass half empty or half full. We don't fail completely. We fail substantially, I would say. We fail more than we would like to fail. And of course, the short answer of why this is the case, we tend to be reasonably good at predicting mortality at the individual level under controlled greenhouse conditions, for example. But as far as we try to do that in the field, and we do that in plots in which there is not only one species, but several species that interact, and even worse, if we try to do that along wide environmental ranges in which species composition also change and the interactions might also change, etc., the predictions tend to be worse and worse. And I think we also know reasonably well why this is the case. And there are many explanations for this. One obvious one is that, of course, hydraulics and this P50, this vulnerability to embolism, is a very important trait, but believing that this is the only trait that we need to predict mortality is being a bit naive, I would say. And of course we know, and this is again another, well, the same actually paper by Belinda, we know that there are many traits involved in drought responses. And it's not only this P50, or it's not only about hydraulics, but actually even worse, or even better in a way, these traits do not operate in isolation. Again, thinking that it's just putting together, adding the effect of several traits, it's again being a bit naive, because all these traits interact, and they interact in the context of a whole organism phenotype. And this is, again, complicated, because the interactions that we see in one species, for example, can be very different to the ones we see in another species, just because it's contextual, and it's the whole phenotype that really needs to work. It's not about individual interactions. So we are working a lot now in trying to understand a little bit better this coordination between different traits and how it translates into performance under drought. It's also the case that in many cases, these models, like the ones Belinda presented, the ones we use, and the ones many people use, assume that traits are species-level properties, and they don't change within a species, but that's not the case, and we know this perfectly well. We know that traits may be locally adapted, and they change actually in response to the environment, spatially, but also temporally. They have plasticity. And this plasticity sometimes changes a lot the outcome of what we predict. And finally, it's also these traits, and now I go back to this initial map of the world I showed with these effects of high also mortality or many mortality events in the Amazon. It's not only about how vulnerable the species are, which we might agree have to do with traits somehow, or we can predict that from traits. It's about exposure. And exposure can be very different, and it's not very easy to characterize. And actually, this is the reason why, in a very wet place like the Amazon, because precisely the species are also not very tolerant to drought, just an increase in drought that in relative terms might be as high or low as the ones we have here, we can also see drought-induced mortality there. And finally, something I was not planning to discuss, but since Belinda mentioned it, which is something also we have been thinking a lot, is that if we want to really predict this, not only the mortality itself, but what is going to happen, not the vegetation dynamics in the longer term, we need to place this in a demographic context, and that means that regeneration in general, which involves resprouting, which is obviously also incredibly important here, needs to be accounted for directly. And this is not obvious, because then we are talking about a completely different set of traits, probably, and we understand even less how these traits coordinate with these traits. So that's also work for the future, I think. And of course, something else that was already mentioned, it's not only about droughts. It's not that disturbances come in isolation. They tend to be related to each other. Droughts are very much related to wildfires. They are also very much related to pests, because when plants have been affected by drought, they tend to be more easily affected by pests or even by some pathogens. So if we want to make really predictions that are realistic in the field, we need to integrate these things to some extent. Otherwise, we will just be looking at a small part of the world. So entering the last part of the presentation, I think there are some reasons to be optimistic in that we are making progress in really making our models, our predictions more accurate. And one of them, and this is, I believe, a paper by Victor, so well, at least you were involved, I think, in this paper, so it's a sort of linkage between the preceding and the next talk. These hydraulic parameters that I mentioned a little bit, and Belinda explained a bit further, actually are also quite central to the prediction, not only obviously of drought effects, but also to the prediction of fire effects. And that's because, of course, dry vegetation makes a much better fuel than wet vegetation. So it really, the type of traits that people working in wildfires have been using are actually are identical, but maybe expressed in a slightly different manner, to the traits that the drought people have been using for a long time in trying to predict or understand drought responses. And these are good news, because it really makes a connection between the responses to these very different stressors. And to some extent, the same applies also to pests and pathogens. So I think there is a lot to be gained from looking into these variables in a more integrative manner that also accounts for these other disturbances. And of course, we've been improving the models we are using. Belinda explained already the LPG gas. I think Danny will talk about Gotilva, which is a model that was developed here at the University of Barcelona by Carlos, who is here, and Santi, and now Danny for a long time. And I think it was a model that was very visionary in many ways. No? But starting by the name, growth of trees is limited by water, so that's what we are talking about. We are using a different model developed by Miquel de Cáceres, who is also here in the room, called MedFate. I will not get at all into the details of the model, but it's basically a vegetation dynamics model at the landscape scale that it's a a mechanistic model that uses traits, and it uses specifically hydraulic traits to make predictions. It suffers from some of the issues I mentioned before, but also Miquel has been really trying also to introduce many of the solutions based on the most recent research on how traits behave, how traits integrate, etc. And what I think is interesting is that we are also starting, or he is also starting to couple these models with predictions. For example, this is an app that he has developed and that can be accessed online, in which basically this model is used to produce predictions of drought and wildfire risks that are daily updated. So I think this really sort of fills the gap between the research we can do and the best predictions we can deliver and their use for, in management or in making decisions about when and where there might be an event of forest decline. And finally, the last thing I wanted to mention is that I think that we certainly need to continue working on improving our models, on improving the way we understand how the different traits we measure interact and coordinate to really explain the responses of plants to any of the stress factors we mentioned. But at the same time, I think we need to develop probably more empirical and general indicators that are not very much dependent on the traits, that are maybe more epiphenomenological in that they integrate the responses already. And I think that remote sensing, but a different type of remote sensing to the one that Belinda explained, has a lot of potential there, because there are particularly microwave remote sensing has developed a lot in the recent decades, and it's now able to measure vegetation water content with quite a good accuracy. And I think that opens the possibility of really having, and this has already been done in some cases, having time series of this quantity, which we believe really integrates the water status of the plant and many of the hydraulic processes we've been discussing. And by having this temporally resolved, this time series of vegetation water content over very large spatial scales, that really opens the way to develop, for example, early warning signals based on the behavior of this temporal signal before the mortality or the effects we are interested occurs. And as I said, there are already some papers showing that this is indeed possible. So I think there is a lot of potential there, and particularly a lot of potential, and this is again something we are working on, in bringing together these remote sensing views on vegetation water content and the physiological understanding we have at the leaf and at the plant level. And with this, I will end by leaving you with this artwork, in which I think it highlights quite well the fragility of the transport system of plants. Thanks very much.
Victor.
All right. Well, good morning. Thanks for the opportunity of being here. It's a pleasure. hanging out with Belinda after so many years. So thanks, Santi, and everyone for putting this together. We've been talking a lot about drought and physiological mechanisms so far, and that's a part of my background too. But today, I'm going to focus more about forest fires and forest management, sort of trying to add more pieces to this puzzle that we're trying to resolve here. And I'm going also to try to make some connections between Europe and Australia, since I can take advantage of the great things I learned while I was there. So, yeah, pyrocene, they shouldn't be here. This is just, I don't want to be, this is from a different talk, the pyrocene word, they should have deleted it. But what's fueling the flames? So if we think about wildfires, there's four drivers of this large fire behavior, right? If we follow Ross-Bradstock's scheme, the first one is we need to have enough fuel, and that means tons of hectares, but that also means, and maybe more important, a lot of fuel around the landscape, having lots of shrubs, trees, and so on over large portions of the landscape. That's sort of the first ingredient. Then the second ingredient that we need is that fuel needs to be dry enough to burn. If it just rained like it's been raining these days, then it's very unlikely we're going to have a large fire. And when we have these two ingredients, which, well, I'm talking about ingredients, but we can also think as switches. We have these two switches on, then we have a critically flammable landscape, and then once we have an ignition source, we have a fire, and that can become into a large wildfire if we have the right weather conditions for it. So this could be the four switches that we have. And this takes us to a classic discussion that we have in fire behavior, and is, what is it that's driving wildfire activity? Is it the fuel that we have? Or is it more the weather that we have? Fuel could be this one, and then the weather would act here to drying the fuel, and as well as affecting fire propagation afterwards. So I'm going to be trying to explain at least my view on how this interaction between global warming and weather effects on fuel, climatic effects on fuel, relative to fuel accumulation, how those impact to affect wildfires, and in relation to management. So this is a study that we did many years ago. We have now spoken about vapor pressure deficit, this indicator of how dry the atmosphere is or how thirsty it is. So that's a study we did for Europe. We divided Europe into different pyroregions. That's not really important. But the key was that we saw that sort of the bulk of the burned area could be explained by vapor pressure deficit. Essentially, it explained about 55% of the variation. What we also saw was that as we add more of these switches, in this case, we're only talking about weather switches, like wind speed, EVI, which in this case indicates light fuel moisture content, and the sea highness index, which is an indicator of, what is my mouse here, which is an indicator of atmospheric stability. As we have more of these switches on, meaning that we have VPD very low, wind speed very high, above the critical values for spread. When we have light fuel moisture very low, or when we have a lot of atmospheric instability, we see that the fire size is increasing, because fires essentially grow unconstrained. We have these diminishing constraints on fire, which sets the stage for having these large conflagrations. Where are we going to be heading to? Well, probably here in the Mediterranean, we're going to be seeing increases in fire activity for the processes that have been already discussed, increasing forest mortality, and so on. But then at some point, we're likely going to experience fuel limitations, meaning that perhaps towards the end of the century, we're going to see that fuel is declining, and there may not be so much fuel to burn as there is now. But something very different could happen in our mountain areas, like in this case in the Pyrenees. Here we calculated what we call the safety margin, which is a word that I borrowed from the hydraulics literature. In this case, it's to indicate how dry does it need to get for Pyrenees to start burning. So Pyrenees now only seldom have fires, and fires so far over there have been small. And this is because moisture sort of protects forest from fire. VPD is kind of high, VPD is kind of low, sorry. And so that sort of prevents the occurrence of these large wildfires. But as climate change is kicking in, as global warming is tightening its grip, this safety margin, this difference between the VPD that we have in Pyrenees and the VPD that we have in the surrounding biomes, like in the Mediterranean biome surrounding the Pyrenees, this safety margin is going to be narrowing down. So using this approach, we can estimate that once VPD increases by 0.5 kilopascals in the Pyrenees, large wildfires are likely. If it increases 1.5 kilopascals during heat wave, these large wildfires are very likely to occur. I'm going to extend more on weather because there has been a lot of talks already about that. I'm going to focus the rest of my talk on sort of management, which is also what we discussed with Santi. But keep in mind that, weather has an overarching goal, an overarching role. And as climate change, we can expect the fuel is going to become drier and the fire seasons are going to become longer. We said that VPD is the major driver of burn area here, and Jordi mentioned before that VPD was going to increase. So, if you put those two things together, it's already showing us that fire seasons are going to be becoming longer, potentially creating the conditions for large wildfires. Now, let's go to the other side of the equation, which is what happens with fuel. And right now, and Jordi also spoke about this in his talk, we have a lot of forest area, of closed forest area. Here, probably this is the surface of closed forest area according to the Catalan Forest Observatory. This is the percent of closed forest for the last 12,000 years, and this is the proportion of forest for the last 100,000 years. Probably the definitions of what a closed forest is are going to vary from one study to the other. They're not directly comparable, but we can already see that current surface of closed forest is actually pretty close to the historical maximum during the Holocene and during the late Pleistocene. So forest surface, closed forest surface has been increasing a lot. And that's one of the factors that's creating more fuel. And what are we doing with this forest management? How are we going to manage this forest? And what's happening, for instance, with protection? The way we are handling protected areas, is that exacerbating the fire problem, or is that diminishing the fire problem? So here we have data for Australia, as well as for southwestern Europe. Australia is not the whole of it, it's just southeastern Australia, so Melbourne and New South Wales. And Europe is also not the whole of it, it's the southwest, so Portugal, Spain, and south of France. And what we have is that, for instance, if we look at Australia, the TBLM biome means that temperate broadleaf mixed forest. So in Europe, essentially, this means like the Cantabrian Mountains, and this is the Mediterranean biome. So for instance, in Australia, we see that on average, protected areas occupy 17% of the land, but nearly 30% of the burn area occurs in protected areas. So it appears that fire is selecting protected areas. It's prioritizing them. If we look at the Mediterranean biome, the effect is even larger. The protected areas are in 19% of the landscape, but they actually concentrate 50% of all the forest, of all the fires. Here we have filtered, and we have only included forest areas. We haven't included like crops and cities and so on, because of course, those things don't burn and can mess up with our statistics. The slopes are not significant in most of these cases, but the differences in the mean values are striking. If we look at what's happening here, we see that in the Cantabrian Mountains, in the TBLM biome, the surface, the protected area surface has increased from, let's say, 24 up to 27% or something like that of the forest area is protected. But wildfires have increased from, let's say, 20% to over 50% currently. So protected areas are increasing, but forest fires in protected areas are increasing at a much higher rate. If we look at what's happening here, we see no differences at all. the protected areas have increased, and the burned area in protected areas has increased at exactly the same path. So protected areas are burning as much as we expect from the cover that they occupy. But this is telling us that in some areas, fires seem to be preferring protected areas. If we move beyond burned area into severity, we see a coherent response across biomes. There is always a 20% increase in severity of the fire within protected areas. We see that, and severity means the damage that fire creates to the forest, and that's sort of a proxy in a way for the intensity, for how much energy that fire is emitting. So fire severity in this protected forest, we see it's 20% higher. And if we look at the exposure of people, if we look at exposure of citizens to fire, again, we see there is a bias towards protected areas. So here we looked at people living in the periphery of protected areas and people living in the periphery of forest areas that are not protected. And we computed the ratio above both of them. So for example, a value of 20 here would mean that it's 20 times more likely for a person living in the periphery of a protected forest to be exposed to fire than somebody who's living in the periphery of a forest that's not protected. And by exposure, we mean that fires were less than 500 meters to the urban area where you are. So we see consistently for Australia, Europe, as well as other parts of the world, that people are much more exposed to fire when they're living in the periphery of protected areas relative to those who live in the periphery of forests that are not protected. And in both Australia and Europe, this increase in exposure has been increasing significantly over time. In California and Chile, the effect has not increased. Over time, the slope has remained constant, but we again see higher exposure to the population in protected areas. And this is important because we have to remember that, for instance, in Europe, we have lost more people to wildfires than to terrorist attacks. So when we think of fires, we often think of an ecological issue, right? Those of us who come from an ecology background, we think of forest dynamics, disturbances. Maybe the general public also has this image that forest fires are something that happens out there in the back. But it is becoming a civil protection issue, and it's increasingly becoming so. So we need to pay attention to these things also in terms of citizen safety. If we look at the drivers of what's driving this response, well, some of these factors we see are manageable. Like here in the Mediterranean, the fuel loads seem to have the largest effect size. This is something that's clearly manageable. And some other issues like road density are also affecting the response. And then we have some factors that we cannot manage, like elevation or vapor pressure deficit. This is a study that was conducted by some colleagues in the Forestry Center in Solsona, and they were looking at the differences in the severity of the fire, this proxy for intensity, between pure stands, which would be at the end of the axis of the graph, or mixed forests, which would be right in the middle. And what they found was that these mixed forests are the ones that show the highest severity, likely indicating this highest intensity, because they had more structural complexity. This is data using data from the forest inventory. So these mixed forests, nearly always, with these two exceptions, were the ones that were having the highest severity. One thing that's also being discussed in relation to forest management these days here is the role of deadwood, which is increasing a lot, of course, after this drought-induced mortality, and also because there are management practices that actively encourage the presence of this deadwood. Deadwood is not one of the main drivers of forest fires, but it can influence them. So to see an example of how deadwood interacts with fire behavior, this is a fire from Torre del Español. This was 2019. I could have shown a more recent example, but that's good enough. So this, you can see, this is a wind-driven fire. There was a lot of wind, and so this is FRP. This is the energy that the satellites can measure how much energy that is emitting. So there were a lot of flames during the first day. I think it burned like 5,000 hectares in the first day or so. And then during the night, there were no flames. During the night, the fires were put out in a way. But on the second day, then the flames were back again. So what happened during the night? The combustion was still there. It was just smoldering combustion. It was not flaming combustion. And the thing that kept the smoldering combustion was actually the dead wood, because this was Pinus alepensis stance. This is something that we can expect to happen in these places, this type of dry forests that don't have a lot of organic matter. When in the forest you have a lot of organic matter, smoldering combustion can go there. But in this Mediterranean dry forest that lack organic matter, having lots of dead wood can ensure that fires will be longer. And also, one issue that we see when there are large loads of this deadwood stuff is that they're going to increase the intensity of the flames. Sometimes it's going to increase the post-frontal intensity of the flames, meaning that the front has passed, but the interior is still burning. One thing that is interesting is about what happens with plantations, because in Spain we had a lot of plantations after the 1940s, as many of you know, and those are very flammable ecosystem. It's one of the ecosystems that burns the most. And that's because they have a lot of fuel in it. And people working with fire, when we say fuel, we're talking about the understory, basically, because that's what carries the fire. So these old pine plantations, they have lots of understory, and they are not managed at all, and so they're very flammable. But if we look at what happens with these short rotation plantations, this is the case of eucalypt, we see the opposite response. For instance, in Portugal, similar to what has happened in Galicia and other parts of Spain, the area under eucalypt has increased like crazy over the last few decades, while the burn area in eucalypt has not. So which is again hinting that these industrial plantations, because they are devoid of fuel, are not going to be enhancing fire propagation. Of course, the problem is what's going to happen if these plantations get abandoned, because they will get abandoned, especially if we continue with the rural abandonment trends, right? And then they're likely to become just like the old pine plantations that we have here with a lot of fuel. But so far, these industrial plantations seem to have very low fuel, and consequently high resistance to fire spread. So, what is it? Weather or fuel? We've been talking about both of them. So this is what we sort of expect based on first principles. That first, the fuel effect is important, and by first I mean when environmental conditions are not particularly extreme, but then under extreme weather conditions, we expect that weather is sort of the main driver. That's kind of what we saw in the Sydney fires in 2019, 2020, in a paper led by Rose Baratzok. We saw that we had different fire intensities for different fuel loads. Traditionally, the fire community in Australia has estimated fuel loads from the time since last fire. So we see that colors here, the severity of the fire was independent of the colors here. So for this event, fuel loads were sort of independent. They didn't impact the fire severity. And what we saw that there was an important effect was, again, this forest area in critically dry fuel state, which essentially means how much was drier than a certain VPD threshold. Again, this magic VPD number that we've been talking about. So we couldn't ascribe the mega fires to forests. We could ascribe it to weather. But when we're talking about extreme fire events, what are we talking about, and why is weather so important? So this is a video. Marc Castelló from the Catalan Fire Rescue Service lent me this video. This is what happened in Pedrogao Grande. This is a port fire in Portugal. It had a pyroconvective phenomenon. So the column condensed. It created a fire, what is called a firestorm. This was in 2007. In this fire, we had over 60 people being trapped. In the 2019-2020 fires, we had a lot of these pyroconvective events, but just on a colossal scale. So to give you an idea of what an extreme fire means and how quickly it can spread, and why, when we reach that point, it doesn't really matter what fuel we have. This is very significant. So here we have the column that's developing. And what we saw here is that as the afternoon was advancing, and there was this mass of wet clouds, and now see what happens. with the landscape. The column is now going to collapse because it has this entry of moisture from Spain. Now the column is going to collapse. And we had 5,000 hectares go in flames in 11 minutes. 5,000 hectares in 11 minutes. So of course, when you have these extreme events, it doesn't really matter what fuel you have. It's not going to affect the severity of the fire that you have. But fuel management will still be important to sort of try to decrease, to mitigate the influence of these effects. So prevention still diminishes the chances of extreme fire developing, but once you have these extreme fires, management doesn't play a role. Leveraging burn area in Australia, Belinda's colleague Matthias Bohr has estimated to be 1 to 3, meaning that you need to burn in a prescribed fashion 3 hectares to save 1 from a wildfire. Colleagues from Portugal have estimated that this leverage here is a bit higher. It's 1 to 5. So this means we need to fight with prescribed fire between 3 to 5 times annually the area that is burned to try to diminish the extreme fire development. In Western Australia, they do a lot of prescribed burns, and 80% of what burns there occurs in prescribed burns. And one thing that's important to keep in mind is that climate change is going to decrease the leverage. So it's going to decrease the leverage in the sense that this ratio is going to be more and more disproportional, and the effectiveness on these prescribed burns are going to be diminishing under global warming. So, yeah, so what do we mean when we mean by management and fire prevention? Of course, prescribed burning is often the most effective way because it's the only thing that diminishes the dead fuel. But we need to combine different strategies to create this landscape heterogeneity. And especially for protecting urban environments, because let's remember, once again, that forest fires are not just an ecological issue, but also a civil protection issue. So just as take-home messages, extreme fires is a civil protection issue. It's going to increase under climate change. Management can still decrease the chances of extreme fire behavior. Current management in protected areas is exacerbating population exposure to fire, so it's an issue that we need to deal with. And we need to better understand extreme fire behavior, because when we started working with these things, and we said that was 10 years ago, and we developed some models about VPD and its effect on fuel moisture and fire behavior, we were talking about vapor pressure deficit, and that was fine, but that was 10 years ago. Right now, we cannot explain these patterns. We cannot explain extreme fire behavior. We cannot explain pyroconvection and what's driving these processes. So I think we need to move beyond saying just that it's dry, that it's hot, that VPD is high, that fire weather index is whatever, and trying to understand the mechanisms that are really driving this process. And that's all that I had. Thanks.
Good morning to everybody, and thanks for coming, and thanks for the help of Global Sustainability for inviting me. I'm going to talk, I'm mostly an ecophysiologist and a modeler, but today I'm going to talk about forest management and forest ecosystem services in the Mediterranean forests. The main ideas of my talk are that forest management can boost stand resilience, that different management goals require different management strategies, and finally, that climate change will modify the optimal management for several goals. So we will see all of those items developed in my talk. Okay, some context on the Mediterranean have been provided exhaustively by Jordi and Victor and Belinda before. So just to say that we live in a hot and dry region of the world. that leads to periodic and recurrent stress on forest ecosystems, mostly during summer. But one of the most important drivers for forest ecosystems in the Mediterranean is the human activity. We have been modifying during the last millennia the ecosystems in this region, and we are expecting to keep modifying so. Well, and the projections for Spanish forests, which are, so Spanish forests by the end of this century, according to the most optimistic or the most pessimistic climate projections, are expected to lose between the 30 and the 60% of their bioclimatic distribution, which will lead to effects on overall ecosystem services and, and ecosystem ecological conditions. But not only to ecological determinants, but as well to loss of forest ecosystem services. Such ecosystem services are very important for society, and this is important in a place where society has evolved as deeply connected with the forest as in our region. Forest provides us by a wide range of forest ecosystem goods and services, ranging for provisioning, regulating, and cultural services here right. For the provisioning, we can have the timber, the firewood, the mushroom production. In the regulating services, we observe that soil erosion prevention, the CO2 uptake, the famous CO2 uptake, and also flood prevention. And we shall not forget about these cultural services that forests provide us, like tourism or ecotourism and heritage, to the spiritual and well-being for the human society. There is a gradient within Catalonia in these forest ecosystem services that forests provide to society. In the moister Catalonia, here in the northernmost part of the country, or the region, depending on who you ask for, we find that the most important ecosystem services are the ones providing us with goods and services and regulating our ecosystems, whereas in the driest regions of Catalonia, we have observed that such services are not as much as important, but the cultural ones are very important there. Such cultural services are arranged following the coastal Mediterranean and mostly located around deeply populated areas. And is in one of those areas in which I want to present some results, some recent results. During the winter of 2023, we observed a widespread tree mortality event in the Penin of the Montañas de Prades in Poblet, located in the dry Catalonia, or the dry area of Catalonia, where 45 hectares of Pinus pinaster planted during the 60s was affected by widespread tree mortality. We were lucky because some patches within the stand were managed and some of them were unmanaged. This allowed for us to develop the master thesis, Santi and I directed Laia Llecera, in which we analyzed which were the drivers of such mortality. The first thing we noted is that the last 4 years where precipitation was below average, and especially 2023 presented 2 standard deviation lower than average precipitations. This led to worsened tree health that allowed bark beetle
to enter the mass and produced an infestation by these bark beetles, these tomicook destruents. So the question was settled. We wanted to observe if managed and unmanaged stands presented different mortality rates, and which were the patterns or what was the explanation behind those mortality rates. What we did is we go to the field and we established several, we measured several stands, both managed and unmanaged, and characterized the forest mass. And we found that the probability of affection in the unmanaged stands was much higher than in managed ones, both by the trees there dying or the trees there being affected with crown browning. This led to 3 to 5 times higher mortality chances for the trees in the unmanaged stands to die for the drought and pest infestation. So we can start to see this pattern. But we wanted to go deeper into the question, because in the same stand we found trees that were seemingly alive and well, just by the side of trees that have ended dying. So we asked ourselves why could be that this phenomenon happened, and we generated a couple of hypotheses about why. The first one being that trees that ended dying by drought and infestation were already manifesting signals in stress in their growth. The second hypothesis was that trees that survived were favored by selective thinning, so management would have improved overall tree health. To check those hypotheses, we took cores. It's worth to say that this mass was entirely removed to prevent further infection or pest infestation from the stand, so we could take advantage of that to analyze both standing tree and standing alive and standing dead trees. And we measured these radial sections in order to assess the growth patterns. The first result that struck to us is that in unmanaged stands, if we split the growth patterns of the dead and surviving trees, what you observe is that the growth signal diverges like 30 years ago. So these forests or these trees have strong drought legacies in their growth that have conditioned the fact that they ended up dying or surviving during 2023's extreme drought event. Finally, when we compare the standardized basal area increase in both managed and unmanaged, we observe no difference in the unmanaged forest. Here we can see, I can see the pointer here. Here we can see no difference in the trend, in the growth trend, but after the thinning, we can see that trees that ended up surviving were the ones that benefited the most of such management intervention. So our conclusion is that the management intervention here bolstered tree health, so reducing competition reducing competition between the trees in the stand. Basically, what did is to allow some trees to behave better and withstand better the drought than in the unmanaged stands. This is just an example of a recent work of us in order to illustrate how this management can influence the forest system, the forest services that they offer to us, and how we can modify the effects on disturbances on those forests. But here, I would like to go to the main topic of the talk, which is how we can optimize such management, providing we know all those caveats that we will face in the near future,
and that our forests provide a wider range of of services to society. Well, we cannot just go to a forest and evaluate this 50 years ago, because this will be pointless. The system will be already undergoing. So we need to use, these are the questions that we planned, and sorry, I forgot to mention. But the first question is, which is the optimum management for the different forest ecosystem services? And the second question, which gave the talk to this, gave the name to this talk, is whether or not there are synergies and trade-off among these forest ecosystem services regarding their optimal management, which is very interesting because if, for instance, we aim to manage a forest system for water yield increase, maybe we are losing some wood in the process, or maybe if we are aiming to reduce fire risk vulnerability, which was not addressed in the topic, unfortunately, which was not addressed here by us, unfortunately, maybe we are losing in some wood production or economical revenue. So how did we do this? So we went to modeling. We used our simulation model, the Gotilba model, which we are currently developing within our team, developed initially by Dr. Carles Gracia and Dr. Sandy Sabater, and we are still under development, as most of the models are. We need some drivers of this model, so climate conditions and soil conditions, and a given ecophysiological description for a species, the Pinus sylvestris. Then we need some management to optimize. In our case, the results I will present are a management consisting in 4 management interventions, in which the year and the intensity of such intervention can change, summarized by a final cut. And finally, we need some evaluation indices to evaluate the behavior of this management with relation to the other array of managements developed. Which indexes we selected to represent the forest ecosystem services? Well, the first one is the wood production, the most simple one. This is the timber yield obtained across the whole simulation. Then we selected the saw wood production. So high quality wood have usually higher economical impact and also a higher residence time, which leads to increased carbon sequestration. So it is important to know how much high quality wood we can extract from the system. We also evaluate how much water do the management provide us in relation to the same forest stand without any management available or implemented. How management reduces drought stress in relation to the unmanaged forest. How much carbon allows us to storage in the system, but it's not a simple balance approach. I will not extend further, but this carbon is related and weighted by the wood quality. So we assumed that higher wood qualities will present higher carbon residence times in their products that offered to society. So we weighted the carbon storage by that in a metric called carbon years. And finally, the soil exploitation value, so how much revenue we can expect from the stand at the end of the rotation length. Well, what we found is that the optimum management clearly depends on the goal. As an example of how these simulations go, for 2,500 simulations, we let the model to optimize those management regimes. And as an example, here we have the average carbon uptake and the blue water increase here in the lower panel. And you can observe that the optimum management rotation length is completely opposite. By increasing the rotation length, we maximize the carbon that that the forest is able to capture and maintain in their wood, whilst by reducing the rotation length, what we are maximizing is the water yield of this system. When this was addressed for the different indexes, we can see here the indexes put it in an order of rotation length, in which the water-related ones are the shorter rotation length, whilst the ones that are more related to wood quality and the carbon storage are the ones that presented the longer rotation length. But we did not stop here. We aimed also to assess the synergies and trade-offs among those forest ecosystems if we could pull them together into management recommendations. First, we need to define what's a trade-off. A trade-off is the gain in a variable or the loss in a variable for the gain in another. In this case, what we lose in variable 2 for an increase in variable 1, but this linear approach did not fit to our narrative, so we needed to use another definition, which is how much of the 1% maximum value of one given variable do we maintain when managing optimally for another variable. This, we developed an index that you can see here. It's the index of synergy that ranges from 0 to 100%, being 0 a complete trade-off among the forest ecosystem services, and 100% the complete synergy among the different forest ecosystem services. When addressing the different ecosystem services checked in this work, we observe that we find the most strong trade-offs between carbon stock and carbon and water variables, whilst yield or wood yield and high quality wood were also in a strong trade-off. We can either have high wood production or high quality wood production, but not the same. And the most synergies were amongst water-related variables or forest ecosystem services and soil expectation value, and this high quality wood and the carbon stock capability. So forests in which we promote the production of of bigger logs and more quality wood production we expect that will keep their carbon stock for longer. And finally, we addressed how climate change impacts these optimum management regimes. So here we can see the average carbon years in relation to the rotation length for different climate change scenarios. And we can see that even though under the current conditions, we observe that the optimum management length rotation length is around 90 years, we see that the more intense the climate change becomes, the shorter the rotation length becomes as well. Regarding water, we observe not much differences in the optimal rotation length or the optimal management, but what we can see is that the increasing severity of the climate change, the less capability we have to manage, or the less ability we have to regulate the water yield of the stand. So this marks us that optimal management will shift depending on the climate change scenario, and we would need to be, or we shall need to be prepared to change our managements accordingly. As take-home messages, I would like to remark that thinning can enhance through resilience to disturbances, as drought or pest infestation, that differences in optimal management procedure depend on management goal, and finally, that climate change shortens optimal management rotation length and reduces potential for water savings, what we saw last. Thank you for your attention, and stay the same.
Good. No. Thank you. Maybe now you can come here. If anyone needs toilets, just take the toilets. But now you can get into upstairs. Yes. My idea was first to get some questions from the people like Teresa and Joan who didn't explain, make a presentation of it, and then we established a bit of the dialogue between the different presentations and expertises. Yeah, so just in 5 minutes we'll get set here. Hola, hola, sí.
És parlar o només per
Sí, per parlar.
Només
Sí.
per parlar, eh?
Sí.
D'acord.
Parla.
1, 2, 3.
Perfecte.
Sí, ja està, no?
Ja queda el clic. Poses on, off.
Vale.
Ja està.
Hello. Hola. Perfect. Okay.
Vale. De moment el poso en off, no? Sí.
Hola. Ui, què tal? Sí, va.
Fas off, ara ja està. Sí, és molt petit, va, no té, és l'altra posició, ja està.
Vale.
Ara.
Comenci, no cal que estiguis a cada moment apagant. Però...
Vale, merci. Ja me'l poso aquí.
Està engegat, eh?
Sí.
Abans, quan vas dir lo de dinar, no pensava dir.
So we're not going to harvest those forests anymore. What are we going to do with them? How are we going to manage them? It's a branch. And where are we going to get them from? Also, yes, absolutely.
Oi? Ah, sí.
Let's start again. Now the idea to switch on and switch off your micros is to have this switch in the, yeah, that's it. You will see the green light when it's on, yeah. So thank you for all the presentations. Now, because they haven't presented anything, but maybe they have questions, I will open the opportunity for Teresa and Joan to ask questions that after this presentation you feel you like to. So, Joan.
Well, it's really very interesting. My goal is to try to live in the forest, and my son's also living in the forest. It's a very difficult goal in Catalonia, but we have the houses of thousands here, there. One thing that I had not understand very well is from Victor Resco, that the mixed forest seems to be more severe in This is very bad for us, because really the mixed forest, especially in the Mediterranean ecosystem, because we have many ecosystems here in Catalonia, but especially in the Mediterranean ecosystem, the mixed forest is our solution, because we have much more things for to live. This is really as that, or we can...
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, mixed forests are important for many reasons, right? I mean, I just focused on fires here. The authors I was not involved in that study. That's from some colleagues from the Forestry Technology Center of Catalonia. And they were ascribing those findings to the fact that when you have more species, you have a higher degree of structural complexity. And what that means is that you have these so-called ladder fuels, having trees of different sizes and shrubs of different sizes sort of allow the flames to climb up to the crown of the tree, develop these huge walls of fire that then are essentially, they cannot be put out by the firefighters. On the positive side, they're likely to be more likely to come back, because if you have more species, then it's more likely that you have one of the traits that allow for recovery. But again, we need to think of forests not only as an ecological issue, it's a social and economical issue for rural communities. I didn't mention that in my talk, but of course it's essential. But also it's a civil protection issue for many people. No? So we need to balance these different issues of biodiversity conservation and having these complex structures with living in the forest. As you were saying before, it's very difficult in Catalonia, and to ensure the protection of citizens as well as the livelihood of the rural population. So the challenge lies in balancing this. And perhaps the solution or the answer to that in areas that are valley bottoms or things that are more wet, maybe this is a place where we can sort of foster this type of management more geared towards biodiversity. Whereas in other areas that are closer to like in the outskirts of Barcelona, the natural park in the outskirts of Barcelona, for instance, maybe then they should have a different type of management that's more focused towards citizen safety. No? So at the end of the day, 47% of the landscape is closed forest. If we look at open ecosystems, it's a lot more. So there is a lot of land and there is scope for different types of management, different types of structures, and yeah, we need to have this open mind idea, no? Rather than having a dogma that we only look for one end. Sometimes we prioritize whatever biodiversity or whatever over the other services, and that makes sense in some cases, but certainly not in all.
Another question. This is for all.
Després em deixaràs, no?
No. Well, the climate change seems that one of the worst things is the temperature augmentation. But this temperature augmentation is also a solution to make water in the atmosphere, because we have less water in one side, but more water in the other, in the atmosphere. Then maybe you must try to take the water of the atmosphere with our ecosystems, because then maybe we can mitigate this climate change. I am chemical engineer and only thinking as that, well, the water is in the atmosphere. Then we must try to take this water from the atmosphere. Then we have laurisilvas, we have many systems to take this water. Nobody speaks about that. And I think that is a thing that maybe we must think in that. In my zone, this is very important. This is very important. It's about, with CREAF we are now, but it's about the double of water that we take from the atmosphere, from the rain. And maybe this is thing very important to study. Only is...
Yeah, I mean, I think he refers mainly on these cloudy areas or when you get humidity that is intercept by vegetation, and then it says also this water getting into the system in addition to the rainfall. Is what it means.
Horizontal precipitation. No?
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah, I'm not aware of regions in Australia where that is a possibility. So, I mean, usually what we find is this, the VPD effect that Geordie was talking about, that when the temperature is hotter, the air can hold more water, but that means that the differential between what's in the plant and the air is actually usually a lot higher, which means that you lose more water from the system more rapidly. So typically what you find as the temperatures rise is that you get much higher evaporation rates, so you're losing more water from the ecosystem faster. And then that doesn't return in the places that you might want it to. But because of the pressure that you have in the air.
But maybe the clouds, the water is the same, because the water is not disappearing. The water is going to the atmosphere. Then maybe these clouds go to another side. This is very possible. But maybe if we have a strong system to at the night, especially at the night, to take this water with the difference of temperature, maybe we must work in this. For example, the islands of Canary Islands, that are in Spain, but in the Atlantic, lives from that. His water is from that. Then maybe we have also laurisilvas in the forest, but maybe we must manage better to take that. Maybe, I don't know.
If I may, I agree there is potential there, but I think there are different things here that are, because as you said, actually the total amount of water is, I mean, it's changing a little bit, but not very much. What is changing mostly is the rate of the processes in the water cycle. And also, for the same reason that with temperature, the total amount of water the atmosphere can hold, that saturation is increasing very fast. Actually, even if you have slightly more water in the atmosphere, the distance to the saturation, which is what really has to do with condensation and many, I think, of the solutions you are talking about, actually gets farther away, not closer with climate change, even if there is an increase in temperature and the total amount of water vapor in the atmosphere might increase. So I agree with you that there is potential, but at least as far as I know, I don't see that this potential will be increasing under climate change. But I think you are very right in that we tend to sometimes forget very obvious things we can do to manage the water cycle at the local to regional level. And things as simple and old as terracing, they have a massive impact in the local water availability for the forest. And I think this is sometimes forgotten. I mean, we tend to think of very complicated technologies and forget about this sort of older wisdom that we already have. But,
very well, thank you.
Yeah, I guess another point is that one of the effects that we see is the increasing intensity of rainfall. So because you can hold more water in the atmosphere, we have more severe storms. And so you do see potential for a lot more runoff because the water's falling so much faster. So, where you used to have a nice steady soaking rain, now it's like really storms and it just runs off. But that's where the idea that you use terracing or some kind of soil management so that you're changing the water holding capacity of the soil to catch that rain when it falls is one of the strategies that's really under discussion for trying to rehydrate the land. Is that also like that idea of terracing or using
The
lines
terracing, I have experience in that. It's fantastic.
Yeah,
it's
right.
fantastic.
Within a forest ecosystem as well as in an agricultural system, or?
No, it was in a forest system for make plantations. Make plantations, but I do that in a zones that are very poor and a zones with fire risk of a rain fire risk. And this terracing, well, is fantastic. All the rain rests there, completely all. And after, if we have, because this is more easy to mechanization of the cleaning of the trituration, things like that. Then you can make more water in the zone very quickly, and the effect in the trees is fantastic. The effect in the trees is fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, we are also thinking more that in some areas the water that enters the systems in villages is that they are throwing away the water as much fast as possible to this
recovering a Sumerian.
And maybe we have to think to start to work more as a watershed and a sponge, to get the water holding capacity higher in the system.
I think that's a great idea, because if you now try, any forest owner tries to do terraces in, that could be really something. I mean, the administration could.
No, the impact. Also, I have archaeological zones at home. I am archaeologist. I like very much that. But it's very dangerous to make disturbance in this field. But you can solve all. I think thinking in all the things. Yes.
Right.
Maybe Teresa, you want?
Yeah, no, so thank you for inviting me. I'm super honored to be here among this set of super nice researchers. And in fact, my job is I work in this, we call it Forest Ownership Center, which belongs to the public administration and tries to promote sustainable forest management to private forest owners, which are 78% of our forests are privately owned. So I'm like this, not trying to take pieces of each of the research, of the different research groups, and then trying to translate it into a single forest owner in their forest. And this is really difficult. I mean, as you have all said, no, so complex there's a time issue also, no, when you need the results and the results are not ready. And so, yeah, so I have plenty of questions. But the first one, and maybe it's a bit like philosophical and comes from the first sentence. I think Rosina said, at the beginning, she said, yeah, we're all working to adapt forests to climate change. And more, I've been defending management and working in this, promoting forest management all my working life. But now that I see so many scientists after your presentations, like speaking about the benefits of managing, I get it. And after walking in the forest this last year after the drought period, I'm really, I think a lot about whether all this mortality, everything, this self-adaptation capacity of forests, what are we losing? Do we really need to help adapt all the forests, or the value change only those forests that really have, we are adapting the value chain. If I want to produce wood from a conifer and the conifer is dying, okay, I have to do something. But I see, there are all these, somebody said, so there are so many reproducing species after all these conifer dies, and maybe it's time for them to die because they were pioneer species, and now the others are, and of course we won't have wood from conifers, but we would have other type of forests, which maybe the functioning of the ecosystem is not really damaged. Although Jordi said this tree mortality is affecting function of ecosystem. So, but I'm wondering, now I'm saying not this because now I'm in a safe area with scientists and we can talk clearly. So I don't need to.
But this is recorded.
I'm not no politicians, no, I guess. So
Yes, yeah, no, it's an interesting question. And I think, my response to that is always a thought about timescales. So there is, if we lose a lot of trees, then you have a period where your ecosystem is unhealthy and it takes a long time for it to recover from that. So the time for new species to come in on their own, to re-establish, to provide habitat is, decades. So you have a period there where you really don't have a functional forest. What you have is a higher fire risk and a loss of habitat. So my perspective is that we want to try and maintain a continuously healthy, functioning forest for all of those ecosystem service reasons. So, you don't want to intervene unless you have to, but there are certainly cases where you're looking at a real loss of ecosystem function and habitat for quite some period of time. And so thinking about, one of the examples that we have at home is habitat for some of the animals, and I've got a version of that slide with all the different forest types that has all the little animals that live in there. I thought I didn't have time to talk about it, but there's a lot of biodiversity in there that you are at risk of losing, real risk of losing, if you don't manage the forests for that purpose. So koalas is a really good example that we have. They're threatened species. They're absolutely reliant on having access to Eucalyptus viminalis. If you lose Eucalyptus viminalis out of the landscape, you lose your koalas. And and that's the kind of.
I sold the green of the eucalyptus in the zoo of Barcelona for koalas.
Yes, yeah. Anyway, so that's my take.
I would agree with that. I think it's. My impression is that many times we tend to underestimate the resilience of forests. But of course, resilience, there is this thing, resilience of what to what, and I think this is quite important. The resilience of some properties of forests is very high. The resilience of other properties is not as high, and that goes back to Danny's talk, And I think it depends a bit on what we value, or value in a very broad sense, not in an economic sense, of the forest and what we want to keep. And even if, as I said, I think we tend to underestimate resilience, we do know that this resilience is not, it's not infinite, and at some point there will be changes, and some of the changes are quite catastrophic, and are catastrophic also with regards to what we value from the forests in any sense we give to value. And of course, the challenge is to identify when these sort of tipping points, or whatever you want to call them, are more likely to happen, where and when they are more likely to happen. And this is more or less, I think, what is behind most or many of the things that Belinda, or also Victor and I were talking about. I think we are still not there, but it's also a matter of decision. If there is a replacement, of conifer forests by broadleaves in the context of Catalonia, is this a problem? Well, probably from many perspectives, it is not. But I also agree, in some cases, we probably will identify situations in which some catastrophic change is likely to happen, and then I think we should probably intervene. And then there is also the question, it's also an economic question, no? Can we? Because many times that's not an option. And it's not because of ecological knowledge or the willingness to do so. It's because the system in a broader sense is not facilitating this to happen.
If I may add something, and also following the point thrown by Jordi that I think it's very sensible, there's another aspect here that is the current structure of our forests the one that's natural? And what's natural here in the Mediterranean, where there has been such an intense interaction among forest and society? Then should we manage towards our idea of forests, or should we leave the forest be? We know that if we leave the forest be, there will be these issues of climate change, that current species will not be likely adapted to the following conditions. But the current conditions, or the current species, the pine spinaster stand I talk is Atlantic tree species, is an Atlantic tree species that was planted here to try to generate some economical benefit. So it was not an autochthonous tree species. We have to take into account that we have an heritage regarding our forests, and that we should manage towards having this in mind. I mean, maybe the forests that we have are not the forests that should be here, if not was for our action. And also, the point that Jordi made, that maybe the managing forest means that every management intervention requires resources investment. To which extent our society is willing to invest economical and human resources, and even emission resources. So when you enter to a forest to manage, you generate emissions that are not offset by the forest growth for a long period, if they are offset here in the Mediterranean. So we have to put all those items in value in this equation in order to determine which forests are worth managing, which interventions optimize very much the resources invested in these interventions, and then accept that some of the forests will suffer, and maybe we are good with this point.
Yes, I think as you, but with, for example, two examples. The cork forest. The cork forest, it seems now, the cork forest, it seems now that the comarcas of La Selva, of Montseny, of here, of Montnegre, it seems that the cork forest was always there. It seems, but it's not that. As forest, yes, they exist as some individuals, but as forests, no. In the 18th century, with the Champagne discovery, they need cork at Reims. Reims is North France, is no cork oaks there. Then, all the 18th century was only two zones serving cork to Reims, only two zones. Two zones was the Var in France and the Pyrenees and Gavarres in the zone. These are the only two with the Landes also in France had at this moment. This moment, one century serving cork there from these points. After is a good job, and with this good job was planted everywhere where they can. And now we think that all the ecosystem is this one, and not, is implanted. There are many things as that, the pine, the pine, the pinyon pine, many of them. Then we must be careful with maybe one species that seems that is not good for one zone. Maybe yes, is good for one zone. It must be careful in that, in my opinion.
Yeah, and one thing we forget about natural forests as well is that our forests are not natural because we don't have consumers anymore. We don't have macro consumers. We have micro consumers. Yeah. We have the microbes. But in the pre-human era, we used to have herbivores and fires. In the human era, there was a lot of anthropogenic pressure on our forest. And now we are in this transition, of what I call the transition from the Anthropocene to the Pyrocene, in the sense that before humans were managing everything, now we're not managing anything here. We are exporting the ecological, or we're importing the ecological impact of our actions to global south countries and so on, but we're not managing our forests, and so this empty space, this excess biomass that grows unconsumed, sooner or later it will be consumed, and it will probably be consumed by wildfire. No? And in this context, I think we also like forests very much, and we're very fond of forests, and I'm the first fan of forests. But we, I think, need to accept that we're going to lose many of our forests, and we're going to be transitioning into open ecosystems for much of Catalonia, maybe for much of Southeast Australia as well. My knowledge is fading about Southeast Australia at this point. But many areas of the world are going to be experiencing a transition towards more open ecosystems, and we'll have to accept that. And also, the last point I wanted to make that's related to the role of forests with drought is that we often think of drought in hydrological terms or in climate terms, but we forget about the biotic component to drought, which is trees. And we know that in Catalonia, the main reason for the decline in stream flow, in this thing that people call blue water, is tree growth. So this tree mortality thing that we've been working on, typically, this is something that we've been overlooking. And I mean, we, like people from an ecophysiological background, right? We've been tending to underestimate the impact of forest growth towards mortality, and to which point forest mortality is just a self-regulating mechanism of forest that results from this lack of consumers. And restoring management, or restoring consumers, whichever they are, and we'll probably need different consumers for different areas, right? I mean, large herbivores are also not the solution to all our problems. They're going to be useful in some areas and not in others. But yeah, I think we need to think about the consumers of our forests for achieving this transition as we move in the climatic space towards warmer environments.
Any questions from you? You said you have a list of questions.
Yeah, but I don't know which one to choose. I don't know. Maybe on the prediction of mortality. This could be so great to have it, but I've heard today, wait and see, I think, from Jordi, so not ready yet. No? So, because what we are seeing now after this mortality episode after the drought, we, as a government, we're giving grants to the forest owners to remove all the dead wood, because now there's money and there's urgency, because if there's any economic revenue you can get out of this wood, you should be quick, so you go there, but you have one tree here, this is very expensive, you take them, and next year or 6 months later you have again 15 trees, dead trees, and next year, 23 dead trees more. And this makes so unprofitable, not profitable, but uneconomic, I don't know how to say it. So we were trying to find a way to be able to predict, is this, so should we wait, will we have more dying trees or so? So I know all of you are working in this direction, so thank you so much, but we have the feeling, and especially with this modeling, that disturbances are going so fast and quicker, and that it's very difficult to cope with disturbances in the model research timescale and scale. But we need answers very quickly, to be so. Same for the fires, now. And what do we do after we remove all these conifer trees? What do we recommend to the forest owners? So you have whole moke. Do you do something with this whole moke? Do you try to go against this adaptation and try to plant again conifers, or this assisted migration? What we've seen is that now in the Pinus pinaster now, forest owners are planting provenances from Morocco, drought adapted, that's okay, maybe because it's the same tree species, but some forest owners tell me Douglas fir or the American oak have resisted very well this drought, more than others. Should we be? What do you think on that? I don't know, the many...
Yes, in the question of Pinus pinaster proof, very interesting, the observation that the lines begin 25 years ago
diverge.
In this is very important because you don't see that until the moment that begins to then in this, the prediction and the systems of prediction, we have not systems of prediction, the forest owners, but the system of prediction, yes, you can see, if you live there, that you can see less leaf, you can see some symptoms that are symptoms, only symptoms, but very, very far, and you think, no, here the density is too high, or here maybe I make a clearing to see if this could be more, and really, this this go well. This is a good system. Clearings, when you see some difficulties. Yes.
Well, I think Teresa asked, in addition to two things. One is they need to know, okay, let's wait for longer because no, if we do this and next year is again, it is very much expensive that just wait 3 or 4 years and then go to remove all these dead trees. This is one thing. And the other thing was more what to do. Let's support different species and not do that with all this management. We are in these climate change scenarios. And it seems a bit of, to some extent, maybe a contradiction because we want to keep more species because we think let's give room for other potential adaptations, but then it seems that this mixed forest in fires, with fires are not meeting the same objectives when you say, okay, the impact of fires by intensity. So it's, we're suggesting in many cases also to have mixed forests because having more variability in the system exposed to these changes. You know? So
for me, it's the solution. The mixed forest is the solution.
So
then,
I think this is...
I do more. I think no. Here the pine is not good. Better is the cork. And at this moment, I ate the cork. I have an observation that is my observation in my that maybe you can think about. The poor zones, the more poor zones, where the trees has more difficulties, has more sensitivity to drought. At this moment, are better than the zones that always was with water, with no problems, and now these are more severe in the zone rich than in the zone poor. It's curious, but this is my observation at home at this moment. At this moment, because we have a drought terrible.
Maybe growing fast is not a good idea.
Yes.
But can you?
Yeah. Well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are many questions here. So starting from the end, I think this is a very interesting observation. It has to do with this, the relative nature of of risk, really, that really puts together vulnerability with exposure. No? And this is complicated. And just to give an example of how complicated it is at different scales, as I said, at least in Europe, the first drought-induced mortality events that were recorded, or at least published, occurred in the Iberian Peninsula in the 90s. At least, published, for sure they happened before, but published in at least the ones I know. And it was not until much later that similar episodes were detected in Central Europe, for example. But if you look at the last 5 years, or 6 or 7 years, starting 2018, which was an extremely dry year in Central and Northern Europe, there have been many more episodes of drought-induced mortality in Central and Northern Europe, which matches your observation at a different scale than in the Mediterranean. In Catalonia, this sort of changed again due to the last drought of these 3-year droughts we just had. But that is quite interesting, isn't it? Yes. And really, I think, gives the magnitude of the unknown, because this is not something anyone, I think, would have predicted that would happen. And this leads me to the prediction question, which I think, of course, that's very important. That's why so many scientists are sort of working on that. And what happens is, I think, quite typical of predictions. Now, we are quite good at predicting very small local phenomena under controlled conditions, which are not really very interesting in practice, in applied terms. We are, I think, also quite good at making very general predictions, very general statements. So it's not that we don't, we know many things. And probably we know many more things than the ones we use in practice for management, because we can make general statements about what, as I said, we know some species that at the dry limit here are probably more sensitive. They are very likely to disappear. Maybe we don't know. It depends on the area. It might be 50 years. It might be 70. It might be 100. We don't know that. But that certainly can guide, I think, decision making. What we are not very good at, I think, is at making predictions at, say, the scale of years to decades over large spatial scales. And this is and there are many reasons for that, but it's exactly the same that happens with climate. No, it's not difficult to predict the climate in 50 years, but it's quite difficult to predict the temperature tomorrow here at the exterior of this faculty. And because actually climate is such a fundamental element in the predictions of what forests will do, well, certainly we carry over this unpredictability from the climate, and we add many other layers of unpredictability by looking into forests. So, yeah, I think there are many things we can say, but there are very serious limitations to what we can really predict, I think, at present at short time scales. And there are other things I wanted to say, but I don't want to talk more. So,
yeah. But you have quite a specific prediction. Should I cut my dead trees now, or should I wait until next year when I've got more dead trees to take them out again? And that because we can't predict what this summer is going to be like. Yes. We can't say that. That's just from that's the weather scientists that can't help us there. I guess, and I'm thinking about what could you do, and I'm thinking. Really what you can look at is a longer term trend. So it might not be a harsh summer this coming summer, but you can look at what the predictions are for the climate in general over the next few years, decade or so, and start thinking about how to match the stocking of the forest to that general climate. And so, we've talked in various contexts about reducing the number of trees, like looking at the trees that are not performing well already. Those probably are the ones that are likely to die. So one could start thinking about, for each situation, what's the stocking density that's likely to be able to persist in that area, and look at removing. But which is something that we're talking about a lot in Australia at the moment. But what we really want to do is monitoring. So trying to get that information together about, has that been successful? So at the moment, it's a little bit ad hoc discussion at home where people are like, oh yeah, we could do this. But what we really want to do is have a kind of a larger picture of, okay, let's experiment with this in some places with some forest owners and test whether this is actually a worthwhile approach.
We've been promoting thinnings as to saying to forest owners that then the remaining trees will be more vital. So and so I'm happy to see that all your research goes in the same direction. So and that's perfect. But for instance, after this draw, what we've seen is that some places where thinnings were applied, there were this might be an impression, but the trees were much more affected than some others that really were not managing and were retaining moisture or this more humid forest environment, especially the shrubs. And it might be something like an observation only. And so I'm also happy to see this, that I think Jordi was showing this pass from the tree. Most of the models rely on the tree level, but to this more complex ecosystem functioning. I think there are so many things there also, no? But yeah, we're still defending thinnings, no? Which is the normal. I mean, this is what silviculture is about, no? It's just to have more vital trees or more production. And just one thing about this, no? So we tried to set, like 20 years ago, and we are developing it, a network of demonstration plots, no? In private forests, and we have more than 550 now, comparing unmanaged and managed. But of course, because forests, I mean, it's a long-term thing. Now we are beginning to see, what's happening. Do these managed forests grow more than the others, and so on? And this, in some cases, we have been collaborating with researchers from the city of Ciudad, etc., and others. We just follow the growth or the regeneration, which is also a super key point, I think, in this adaptation. And what was I want to say? Now we're trying to classify them between treatments that only aim for and enhance resistance or resilience, or really a transition towards something totally different, even if it's super expensive or whatever. So to try to have conifers again in a mixed forest where conifers have died, maybe we can try. So we are now trying to. We saw this setting in the States in some. I don't know, and this is.
There are one proof that
in Joan's forest we have
engaged that cutting the understory beside the cork trees in the moment with indicator of the diameter system very precise in micros.
Dendrometers.
Yes. At the moment of cutting, the first year, the growth is 300%. 3 times. 3 times, not 20%, no, 3 times. And then you think, well, all this water is one drinking that you pass to the tree, because you have the idea of the stress in the This was for me discovering fantastic. This is fantastic. But that after, if you do that completely clean, no, because then the evapotranspiration is so high that all the invent is finished. You begin to the hydration the soil.
Yeah. That's a really and it's interesting that that's a feasible option to manage the understory in that way. And that would actually, it would certainly have a great impact on fire risk as well, because a lot of the fuel is in that understory. And you were talking about those mixed forests and the ladder fuels, and the fact that you to have a severe fire, you need to get from the ground up into the canopy. So managing that shrub layer is one way to
you must manage the number of feet. The number of feet. Trying to have
shade.
In the soil, trying that. The minimum fits, but to make the
shade. Yeah, we try to maintain the shade in the canopy cover, and then leave. There's a compromise between firemen and biodiversity people and everybody of 30% of the shrub of the under.
Yes, but then you must the Eric arborea that has a lie very, very high. Because there's a very little leaves, but really with many surface. That is fantastic. And the other side, you need the laurisilva, one plant that has a long leaf with wax. That is the system of condensation. You need a system to emit a cloud and a system of condensation. If you have the two things, is only a drop in the soil. And really it's fantastic, it's fantastic. But this is running well 3 years. After 3 years, you must another time make a reorganization. We have 6 years to do that. And that maximum is 6. But in better working at 3 years, you have the maximum water into. And now we have a proof with CREAF that is very interesting. I am that only we have 1 year in proof, and it's not. But seems that could be very nice.
I have one point, because we were talking about predictability of this. We were long ago with Carlos too, and people from Wageningen in a project that was called El Niño. And then the idea was that because we know these El Niño events provide more water in the coast, in the Pacific coast, in the other side of the Andes, it was a good moment for regeneration, and also if you plan to do some interventions like planting trees, would be a good thing, no? But I wonder if you have seen in Australia or taken into account these dynamic events that time to time happens. For instance, you mentioned that after this drought, a lot of water was entering Australia and these type of things. So these patterns, climate patterns, can be used to decide, oh, next year is going to be rainy, or likely rainy.
Window of opportunity.
Yes, these windows of opportunity, I think, are very important, especially for restoration. And what are your thoughts about that?
It's really tricky in Australia because it's so unpredictable, the climate. And I think I'm hopeful that it's easier here, but we have an extremely variable climate. And so from year to year, it's just really difficult to predict. We had, there was an example last year where they wanted to do a big plantation on our campus as part of a restoration action. But September, October, November, we had no rain. So 3 months without rain. And we, all of the scientists were saying, don't do this now. The predictions are for a hot summer, you're just going to lose everything that you plant. But they went ahead because they had all of the plants ready to plant. And then we had a really rainy summer. And it was perfect conditions and everything settled in really nicely. And the gentleman who organised it was like, you scientists. But it's difficult if you're in an unpredictable climate like that. And I think what we're finding in Australia, particularly the region that I'm in, it's becoming even less predictable. So it used to be the case that El Niño and La Niña, which is the southern oscillation, that would allow you to predict, okay, it's an El Niño year, it's going to be dry. But last year was an El Niño year, and we thought it would be dry. But then there was, actually that weather pattern can bring heavy rain too. So, tricky, very tricky for that kind of restoration action and knowing what's coming. But I think, I suspect that there are different parts of the world that have different predictabilities. And so maybe here it's easier to predict what's coming on a seasonal basis.
I think we are maybe only slightly better off here because it's also very quite unpredictable, our climate. But I think it's what you say, Santi, is right, that there is some value in this, knowing that it's going to be a prediction with a probability and it might or might not come true. But it's probably useful to make predictions at this, that can be, for over a few years or so. But I think probably even more promising is just taking advantage of opportunities when they come. So, for example, pretty early in a spring, you can judge much better whether it's going to be quite wet or not. And then you might want to do some actions specifically for this time period. And we do know, for example, that wet years are incredibly important for regeneration, natural regeneration. And of course, they can be used as an opportunity for also, artificial regeneration or whatever, restoration or whatever. So I think it's probably easier to think months in advance than years in advance in our context as well. But that's my feeling.
Do you think we could create this like an alert that now foresters, it's a good time for you to try to plant or to regenerate or to do your final felling? So
possibly. Maybe. I personally would have to learn quite a bit about forestry, but I think this is feasible to some extent. Yes.
But there could be a lot of cost to that because you cannot employ people for 2 weeks and then keep them unemployed for the rest of the year. I mean, we need something that's more stable and more safe.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking about really very punctual actions that you take in very specific places where it's critical because, I don't know, there is a specific danger. Yeah.
Yeah, no, predictions are hard when they're about the future. They're hard to predict. The future is hard. And sometimes I wonder if we're not over-attributing events to climate change in the sense that we can correlate many things with VPD. But we're missing like the data that you guys were talking about all the forestry operations that you guys are doing. I think having those in a map somehow, it could really help us to predictions because we have lots of data. We have lots of weather stations. We have lots of satellites that are telling us what the weather is, where climate stations don't reach. And some people try to get forestry from satellites, and the errors are absolutely ridiculous. There was a paper in Nature or Science, I don't know, a few years ago saying that Europe had gone crazy cutting trees. And if you looked at the map for Catalonia, the areas that they said that there had been lots of harvest were actually areas affected by a caterpillar, by a processionary caterpillar. So it's just outrageous, no? And then that was used by the European Commission to implement a series of policies. So I think that's something that we are really missing to tighten our predictions and not to overemphasize the effect of these things that we use and that I have used, like VPD and so on, would be a map of the forestry operations that have happened, this understory, selective understory removal, or all the actions that go through the CPF and as well in public forest.
I have another question. The system to see the light, the leaves
area index.
Surface.
Leaf area index.
Yes, light is remote, but then you take the light with of the tree and of the understory.
Yes, you do. Yes.
Then this could be because you think only in the tree. And you must think in the ecosystem, maybe.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, and that explains some of the discrepancy that we see.
At home, understory has much more light than the tree, much more, maybe the 80% of the total. Then it is really a system that must be know these things.
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the issues with interpreting that type of satellite data is that it just shows you the greenness of the system of the whole. So if you get a lot of grass or a lot of weeds that come in underneath your burnt trees, it looks like your system has recovered, but it really hasn't.
Yeah, I think we are, maybe if any people from the audience wants to ask a question, would be something that would be nice. Is anyone who wants, because we should also start to close the session. We had some delay at the very beginning, and so we have some delay stopping the session, but we have to end at a certain point. So, Carlos?
Well, thank you very much to all of you for this amazing session. And going to you, Joan, your words have been something magic, because now the atmosphere is turning us some of the water you were claiming for.
For the beginning.
But now, well, I'm sorry to try jump down a little bit from this broad view that you are putting on the table, which is very interesting, to a bit more detailed question. And going back to Belinda's presentation, you pointed out this increase of leaf area index in dry conditions. And the compromise, the commitment between increasing leaf area index and increasing the tissue, conducting tissues as well, so the wood. But, well, I recovered in my mind in some old file that there is a critical variable, and I want to put here, which is the mean leaf life. Because it is quite clear, according to some data, that the mean leaf life is decreasing in broadleaf species. So that means that producing more leaves, more leaf area index, and paying a higher cost to produce this, to maintain this leaf area index, because the leaf life shorter. The question is, where is the point of compromise, the tipping point where the carbon balance, these non-structural carbohydrates can't resist, can't support all this demand of carbon to produce more leaves, which are more expensive because with increasing temperature.
There's a lot in that question. So leaf lifespan, so how long the leaves live for. You're saying there's evidence to suggest that the length of lifespan is decreasing or
leaf
that
turnover is
the leaf
increasing.
Turnover rate is increasing.
This is, for evergreens, there are some data here, but not just here at home. There are many data that put on the table that really the turnover is higher.
Yes.
And the life is shorter.
It's not an easy thing to measure in eucalypts. So I have been asking a lot of people to measure it, but they keep telling me it's because you can't actually go to a eucalypt branch and say, well, this is this year's and that's last year's and this is the year before. So I'm not sure that we see the same pattern. It's possible that the leaf lifespan is shorter in areas with higher temperatures, but I personally don't have evidence to show that for the systems that I have. We do have some evidence, and you probably have similar data to look at the capacity of trees to regenerate their canopies. So if they're re-sprouters, how often can they regenerate their canopy without dying? So in experiments where people defoliate the trees and then look at the rate of recovery, I think there's a suggestion that they can rebuild their canopy 3 times before they finally fail. So but it's not solid data. So it's difficult to point to what that tipping point would be in our systems, I would say. It's a very interesting question, though.
My point is that we cannot dissociate the leaf area index with the cost of produce and maintain these leaves in a context of climate change. I think my impression is that it's a critical point.
I would appreciate seeing the data that you're talking about. That would be helpful.
Thank you.
Miquel?
Hi, I'd like to make a comment rather than a question and hear your opinion about it. So from a point of view of a modeler, about predictability and what is lacking so that we can predict, increase our prediction capacity. So for me, the obvious answer is below ground. So, and Jordi has mentioned it, and I'm sure you know, but so we don't know what's below the ground. So there are two main key variables according to model sensitivity. One is the water holding capacity. So, and for this is the amount of rocks inside the soil that occupy, and then also the root distribution. So root distribution may explain also so that the past conditions of the growth has occurred, the distribution is adapted to this hydroclimate, then changes, and then you observe different responses according to this past. So, but there is the root distribution and the only way I can think of advancing in this is because we will never be able to observe this. Well, I don't know of a device that solves this in terms of observation, direct observation. So and directly we have remote sensing, leaf aerodynamics, and we know that there's this theory of ecological equilibrium of the leaf area. So inverse modeling is for me the right answer about it. This can be done with static values of leaf area index to try to estimate what that will be the soil parameters that would predict this a certain amount of stress. This has been proposed and used, but probably this has to be done in a dynamic context, so with a whole series of leaf area variation and having a model that is able to predict defoliation and recovery according to processes, then try to estimate those key parameters. That's my guess. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure that rooting depth was on your slides several times. That is something that troubles us, is knowing what access there is to deep soil. We certainly see the pattern in so our tree mortality tends to occur on ridge tops. So there's clearly an influence of soil depth. So if you're looking at forests that are on flat areas, usually you have a much less mortality. It's only when you get up onto the tops of the ridges and you've got shallow soil that you really see large mortality events. So yeah, how to get information on that? We're looking at depth to rock. So there has been mapping from the geospatial from Geoscience Australia to try and estimate depth to regolith across the country as a function of soil type and topography. So that's my hope that we will be able to look at that. But I understand also there have been a lot of attempts to look at inverse modelling to try and infer what the rooting depth might be in different locations depending on leaf area, exactly as you say.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think I can add very much to this, but maybe the only thing is that I think, for example, these estimates of vegetation water or canopy water content can also be quite useful for this, because this is going a step further than leaf area index. And I think that this inverse modeling, really taking advantage of this more detailed information on the water status, probably would improve the estimates. But I don't see any other option. It's either inverse modeling or it's improving the technologies to see what happens underground, which is very tricky.
Can I ask a technical question? With that, the canopy water content remote sensing approach, what's actually the resolution that we can currently get to with that? Because that was one thing that blocked us before, was that the resolution was quite coarse, and then you can't really get to the scales that you need to.
It's still, globally, it's still the same. So we are talking about, say, tens of I think it's probably down to 9 by 9 kilometers, which is still a huge pixel.
Yeah.
But there are more and more techniques that allow to do that at regional scales or even locally. So that's something we are trying now, is to use GNSS, which is GPS technology. I mean, this is at the plot level, but to really measure this continuously. And then, of course, the connection with the remote sensing becomes a bit easier as well. Conceptually, you are not, mixing things that are easier. But you are totally right. I think the main limitation for really using these at very large spatial scale is resolution of the
Is this for the free available satellite data that you're talking this?
Yes, and then there are also downscaling methods. But of course, downscaling is, well, you need to be even, it's more difficult to believe on the, even more difficult to believe on that.
Downscaling method.
We did develop a product for live field moisture content that was on 500 meters based on MODIS. And this summer, we've been collaborating with some space company using drones for looking at this, what we are missing with MODIS. With these 500 meters, I mean, it's better than the 9 kilometers, but it still covers. And from a fire perspective, it could complicate things, especially in areas with rough terrain. So now we've been playing with drones and this summer, so next year, if you come back, you have to come back, invite here again, or we'll invite you, and we'll tell you the answer of how that worked. Of course, with drones, you can cover so much, but
yes,
globally, 500.
I guess the difference. So Geordie was talking about the microwave,
right?
Which is different from the MODIS sensor, which has a different. It's measuring something different.
Right, the water in the poly.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I guess we're trying to triangulate this by getting as many different measurements as we can to understand what's going on.
Yeah, well, I think we are at the end of this session. Thank you very much, and we are going to bring Belinda more often. Don't worry, we will be around, hopefully. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Santi. This has been really enjoyable. I've really learned a lot from all of you, and it's been really wonderful to be here and have this discussion. So thank you very much for organising.
Yeah, it's also an opportunity to bring people from. Sometimes we see each other, but sometimes it's good to reconvene and discuss and exchange what we do. Thank you. Yeah.